Hello everyone, and welcome to the 187th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring our delayed patron pick for June 2024, The Governor from The Walking Dead. So The Governor was our patron pick for last month, and I would have had this episode out then, but I do try to do the most when it comes to covering these characters. And it turns out that not only does The Governor originate in the comic series that inspired the TV series, but he's also featured in 4 novels as well, which adds a bevy of details that help to flesh out the comic book version of his character. So I needed a bit of extra time with this one. It's been close to 5 years now since I made my first video, and I say it's a crying shame that it's taken me this long to cover a character from The Walking Dead, so a little kick in the rear from the patrons in this regard was long overdue. So in this video, we're going to cover all there is to know about both the comic book version of the Governor, as well as his televised counterpart, using information from the comics, the aforementioned novels, Rise of the Governor, The Road to Woodbury, The Fall of the Governor Part 1 and 2, and of course, the celebrated TV series that propelled this franchise into the stratosphere. Now, as far as the structure of this video goes, we'll first examine all there is to know about the comic book version of the character before we move on to the show's version. And considering a lot of information between the two overlaps, my coverage of the TV version will be much shorter as a result, especially when you consider that the actor who played the Governor, David Morrissey, studied the Governor's backstory in the comics and the novels to get a better idea of how to portray the character. But there's really nothing short about this video if you couldn't tell. And there's a lot we need to discuss about who the Governor is on the silver screen. So for those of you who haven't read any of the comics or the novels, get ready to learn a lot about the horrors of one of the most iconic and reviled characters that the creators of The Walking Dead ever produced. Now without further ado, let's begin. While the Governor is only one man, Brian Blake, his story is intimately tied to that of another, his younger brother, Philip Blake. Brian Blake was born in 1968 in Waynesboro, Georgia to Rose and Ed Blake, and raised alongside his younger brother Philip in what Brian describes as a shabby little bungalow on Farrell Street. Though Brian was the elder brother, Philip grew to be tall, strong, and confident, while Brian was small and meek. And due to the differences in their personality and size, it was Brian who relied on Philip to protect him in his youth whenever the need arose, despite the traditional role of the elder brother protecting the younger. While both Brian and Philip comment at various points on how their father was an abusive drunk who went overboard when punishing his boys, it's also said that their father attempted to fight his demons as best he could and would infrequently fulfill the role of a loving father, despite his inadequacies. And it would seem that aside from the heavy-handedness of their father, Brian and Philip enjoyed their childhoods in Waynesboro, with adventures in the woods and trips to the circus with their mother being prominent memories of theirs that indicates it wasn't all doom and gloom for the young Blake brothers. In accordance with his meek disposition in his youth, Brian would grow into a similarly meek adult, with his description in Rise of the Governor being the following. Barely 5'7" in his boot heels, Brian Blake is a raw-boned scarecrow of a man scarcely able to fill out his black peg-leg jeans and torn Weezer t-shirt. A mousy goatee, macrame bracelets, and a thatch of dark Ichabod Crane hair complete the picture of a 35-year-old bohemian waif stuck in Peter Pan limbo. It isn't said here in this description, but Brian's voice is also described as being low and nasally. Once Brian graduated from high school, he went on to study at the University of Georgia in Athens, and here he studied comparative literature and obtained a degree that may have involved the subject that Brian would later consider to be useless. Instead of finding a career in his degree field after college, Brian would enter the world of entrepreneurship, concocting numerous business ideas that his brother Philip considered to be harebrained, the latest one prior to the outbreak being his establishment of a music store in Athens that catered to rappers with bling-covered instruments and equipment, all of which he financed using his parents' money. At some point, Brian married a Jamaican woman named Jocelyn, who Brian describes as having been compulsive, volatile, and flaky, a woman who would vanish for weeks at a time, and even put all of Brian's belongings out on the stairs of their apartment building one night while he was at night school. After Brian's latest business endeavor failed and the music store closed, Jocelyn decided to leave him and move back to Jamaica, and with his wife gone and his finances in shambles, Brian chose to move back in with his parents, where he would remain until the outbreak began. In contrast to his elder brother, Philip Blake grew into a strong and imposing man who chose to take a different path in life. Philip's appearance is described thusly in Rise of the Governor. A tall, rangy, sinewy man with the ropey muscles of a tradesman, Philip Blake shares the same dark features as his brother, the same dark almond eyes, and coal-black hair of their Mexican-American mother. Mama Rosa's maiden name was Garcia, and her features had dominated the lineage over those of the boy's father, a big, coarse alcoholic of Scots-Irish descent named Ed Blake. But Philip, 3 years younger than Brian, had gotten all the muscle. He now stands over 6 feet tall in his faded jeans, work boots, and chambray shirt, with a Fu Manchu mustache and jailhouse tats of a biker. Now when Philip came of age, he chose to enter into the workforce, and he eventually married a woman named Sarah and fathered a child with her, his daughter Penny. Philip was every bit the man that his brother wished he could be, and for a time, Philip was content with his life as a hard-working family man. However, 4 years prior to the outbreak, Philip would lose his wife Sarah in a tragic accident, forever changing his world, as tragedies tend to do for any of us. Taking on 2 jobs to provide for Penny, Philip's entire existence was aimed towards providing for his daughter, and for 4 long years he led a grief-stricken life of constant toil that only hardened him further than the death of his wife already had. Now, aside from the obvious differences between the 2 brothers in appearance and character, we find that their experiences in life have served to both further differentiate the 2 in disposition and worldview and drive a wedge between the 2 brothers, as the hard-working Philip would grow to resent his weak-willed family favorite of a brother who's only known the hardships he's inflicted upon himself through his various schemes, a man who always seems to get bailed out by their parents, while Philip has to contend with the hard realities of the world. It's through Brian's aforementioned weakness that the 2 brothers would reunite with one another following the outbreak, as after the news broke and Philip chose to gather up his 2 friends Nick and Bobby to take on the road with Penny and himself, Philip made a detour to Deering to check on his mother and father. When he arrived, Philip learned that the entire population of Deering had been moved to a nearby military base for safekeeping, but for some reason, his brother Brian had been left behind, and Philip found him holed up in his parents' deserted townhouse huddled in the basement crawlspace. Due to his distaste for his brother, Philip had never expected to find him and bring him along with him on the road, but after encountering him here, he had no choice but to bring him along. Brian would end up filling a valuable role in the group though, as due to his moral shortcomings when it comes to killing walkers, which we'll discuss in just a moment, Brian is able to act as Penny's guardian and caretaker, while Philip and his friends deal with any threats, which brings him closer to both his brother and his niece, which will be important to keep in mind as we continue. Now, Philip had become well acquainted with tragedy and hardship, and through adversity, he learned that when life gets tough, the only things you can and should do is what you have to do. So when Philip was forced to contend with hordes of undead humans attempting to harm him or his group, he did what had to be done and annihilated them without a second thought. Brian, on the other hand, a man with a gentler soul, proved to be a burden to his brother's band in this regard right from the outset. Brian, in the first days of the outbreak, was ever conscious of the fact that the walkers were once human, each with their own lives and families. But the hard reality in this situation is that people who turn are no longer people. Just as the body becomes an empty shell once we pass on, these walking death machines are nothing more than reanimated corpses fulfilling a singular function: consume all life that they come across, and to meet them with any sort of hesitation is a virtual death sentence. The difference between Brian and Philip in this regard is best exemplified in this passage from the beginning of Rise of the Governor, a scene where Brian and Philip are conversing after Brian finishes vomiting upon seeing the results of Philip and his friends' clearing of a house they're holed up in, while Brian hid in a closet with Penny. Brian gets himself under control, wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. You think you got all of them? I do. You sure? Yep. You searched everywhere, in the basement and stuff. Yes, sir, we did. All the bedrooms, even the attic. Last one came out of hiding at the sound of that fucking cough, loud enough to wake the fucking dead. Teenage girl, tried to have one of Bobby's chins for lunch. Brian gulps down a raw, painful swallow. These people, they lived here. Philip sighs. Not anymore. Brian manages to look around the room, then gazes up at his brother. Brian's face is wet with tears. But they were like a family. Philip nods, and he doesn't say anything. He feels like giving his brother a shrug. So what? But all he does is keep nodding. He's not thinking about the zombified family he just dispatched, or the implications of all the mind-numbing butchery he's already wreaked over the last 3 days, slaughtering individuals who were recently soccer moms and mailmen and gas station attendants. Yesterday, Brian had gone off on some bullshit intellectual tangent about the difference between morals and ethics in this situation. Morally, one should never kill, ever. But ethically, which is subtly different, one should maintain the policy of killing only if it's in self-defense. But Philip doesn't see what they're doing as killing. You can't kill a thing that's already been killed. What you do is squash it like a bug and move on and stop thinking so much. As important as it is to keep one's humanity in this kind of situation, Philip has the right idea here. But for weeks following the outbreak, Brian struggles to come to terms with this reality. The group stays at this house for a while, believing it to be a well-fortified position that they could potentially hold themselves up in indefinitely. But after they're set upon by a band of walkers, and Bobby is killed by one of the previous occupants of this house, a little boy who had hidden in the family's doghouse and subsequently turned, the group decides to make for Atlanta to try and find the refugee camp that's supposedly been set up there, leaving behind a sign that states all are dead at Wilshire Estates that Rick and his group would later encounter. This occurs roughly a week after the outbreak began, and on their way to Atlanta, their Suburban gets stuck in the mud. And even as Philip rages outside the vehicle attempting to fight off a horde of walkers, Brian still has some hangups about what exactly is and isn't okay in regard to killing walkers, and what that killing can do to a person. His brother is everything to him. His brother is the key. But something is happening to Philip, something horrible, and it's beginning to gnaw at Brian. What are the rules? These walking abominations deserve every thing Philip is dishing out, but what are the rules of engagement? Now, as I said before, we can't really fault Brian for being hesitant about killing walkers, as it is a harrowing business even if it is necessary, and Brian is correct about killing walkers having an effect on some people, which in Philip's case is made evident by passages like this that we receive when he's clearing a warehouse. On his way back toward the front entrance, he discovers a fourth one in the shadows, caught between two massive paper rolls. The bottom half of the former forklift operator is wedged between the building white cylinders. The top half of the creature convulses and flails, its milkstone eyes stupidly awake. "What's up, Bubba?" Philip says as he approaches with the gun at his hip. "Another day, another dollar, huh?" The zombie chomps impotently at the air between its face and Philip. "Lunch break overdue?" Chomp. "Eat this." The .22 caliber blast echoes as the slug smashes through the forklift operator's orbital bone, turning the milky eye black. Philip admires his work of art, the scarlet tendrils on that field of heavenly white, for quite a long time before going to get the others. This is obviously concerning, and while for some constantly killing monsters with human faces can be a slippery slope that lets out one's inner demons, and is certainly something to take into account, in the case of Philip Blake, it's not necessarily the killing that has an adverse effect on him, but the stress that comes along with a leadership role, and the fervent desire to protect your loved ones. Philip became the de facto leader of his group from the outset, and while his daughter's safety is his primary concern, Philip bears the burden of having to guide and protect 3 people whilst also preserving his own life. And for the average person, not the exceptions who take advantage of these types of situations to play out any dark fantasies or inclinations they might have, this is the greatest danger they face to their persons, outside of the obvious danger they're constantly in from walkers, of course. Philip has to make the decisions. Philip has to guide his people to safety, bearing a stressful load that would weigh on any person's psyche. But when you factor in that the entire world has been flipped on its head, and you're only seconds away from life-threatening danger at any moment, danger that could spell the loss of those you're responsible for or yourself, and you have a recipe for potential mental instability that could infect even the strongest-willed amongst us, which is exactly what happens to Philip. For a time, things seemed to be going smoothly for the Blake group, as they managed to find refuge in Atlanta with the Chalmers family. But after Philip assaults one of the Chalmers sisters that he had fallen for in the heat of passion, April Chalmers, and the group are forced to leave Atlanta for greener pastures, things take a drastic turn for the worse. The group chance upon a plantation-style manor where they set up base camp, but all the while they're being followed by a ragtag band of addicts who end up forcing them out of this house after a tense standoff. As they're fleeing, these interlopers decide to take it upon themselves to not just take everything that the Blake group has, but to put them down. And in the ensuing chaos, Penny loses her life, while Brian is attempting to keep her safe, as per his brother's instructions. Brian hardly hears the gunman now, pounding toward him, the snap of the pump injecting another shell. Penny's little shirt, a cotton t-shirt, is soaked with deep scarlet, the ragged exit tear at least 6 inches in diameter. Grains of deer shot propelled by a 20-gauge shell are powerful enough to penetrate steel, and it looks like the child took at least half the expanding cloud of shot through her back and out the side of her tummy. The gunman closes in. Brian lifts the child's shirt and lets out an almost primal moan of anguish. His hand can't staunch the bleeding. Brian presses his hand down on the wound. He rips a piece of his shirt tail and tries to plug the jagged hole in her midsection, but the blood is everywhere now. Brian stammers and cries and tries to talk to her as the oily blood seeps through his fingers, and the gunman draws near. "It's okay. You're gonna be okay. We're gonna get you fixed up. It's gonna be fine. You're gonna be all better." Brian's arms and waist are baptized in the warmth of her life force draining out of her. Penny utters a single feeble whisper. "Away." "No, Penny. No, don't do that. Don't go away yet. Not now. Don't go away." Obviously, this is a harrowing moment for Brian, but that's nothing compared to what it does to Philip once he arrives on the scene. Philip drops to his knees by the dying child. He scoops her up and tenderly touches the gaping wound as though it's just a boo-boo, just a scrape, just a little bump. He draws her into an embrace, her blood soaking him. Brian lies on the ground a few feet away, breathing the musty earth, a curtain of shock pulling down over his eyes. Nick stands nearby. "We can stop the bleeding, right? We can fix her up, right?" Philip cradles the bloody child. Penny expires in his arms in a breathy little death rattle, which leaves her face as white and cold as porcelain. Philip shakes her. "Come on, Pumpkin. Stay with us now. Come on. Stay with us, please. Stay with us. Please stay with us. Pumpkin? Pumpkin? Pumpkin?" The terrible silence hangs in the air. "Sweet Jesus," Nick utters to himself, his gaze going down to the ground. For the longest time, Philip holds the child while Nick stares into the dirt, silently praying. For most of that time, Brian lies prone on the ground 5 feet away, crying into the moist earth, babbling softly more to himself than to anyone else. "I tried. Happened so fast. I couldn't. It was. I can't believe it. I can't. Penny was. All at once, a big gnarled hand wrenches down on the back of Brian's shirt. "What did I say?" Philip snarls a guttural growl as he yanks his brother off the ground and then slams Brian against the trunk of a nearby tree. Brian goes limp. He sees stars. "Philly, no!" Nick tries to step in between the two brothers, but Philip shoves Nick away hard enough to send the smaller man sprawling to the ground. Philip still has his right hand locked around his brother's throat. "What did I say?" Philip slams Brian against the trunk. The back of Brian's skull bounces off the bark, sending veins of light and pain through his field of vision, but he makes no effort to fight back or escape. He wants to die at the hands of his brother. "What did I say? What did I say?" Philip heaves Brian away from the tree. The ground flies up at Brian like a battering ram, smashing one shoulder and the side of his face, and then a fusillade of kicks descends upon Brian as he rolls involuntarily across the ground. One kick from the steel-toed logger boot strikes him in the jaw hard enough to crack his mandible. Another one fractures 3 ribs, sending white-hot pain up his side. Yet another strikes the small of his back, dislocating vertebra and nearly puncturing his kidney. Shiny bright pain splinters his tailbone, and after a while, Brian can hardly feel the pain anymore. He can only watch it unfold from way up above his mangled body as he surrenders to the beating as a supplicant surrenders to a high priest. From here, it's nothing but a downward spiral for Philip Blake. He captures a couple that was part of this group, who he refers to as Sonny and Cher, and tortures them horrifically for days, mutilating their bodies and repeatedly assaulting Cher while Sonny watches. And not only that, but he decides to keep the zombified Penny, the daughter he had centered his world around, who he refuses to let go of. Philip struggles with the darkness he's now immersed himself in, especially after Nick takes it upon himself to execute the couple he's been torturing, and Philip is forced to confront what he's done in the face of his silent brother and his friend. But sadly, it only gets worse from here. This portion of the story is where the group moves on to discover the town of Woodbury, and here they find comforts that they haven't experienced since they linked up with April and her family back in Atlanta. But Philip can't move past the death of Penny, and his only focus now is on finding body parts for her to eat, or worse still, making corpses out of innocent people so he can feed them to Penny. Eventually, Nick can't bear to see Philip waste away any longer, nor can he allow him to continue harming people. So one night when Philip kidnaps a young girl to kill and feed to Penny, he heads off to the woods with Brian to deal with his lost friend. And just as Philip Blake was broken upon his daughter's demise, this is the moment where Brian Blake, the man with a kind heart and a gentle soul, is broken. "Nick, wait!" Brian gets halfway through the brambles when he sees the deadly tableau taking shape in the shadowy clearing like an arrangement of players on a surreal chessboard, coming together in dreamy slow motion. Nick stumbles out into the open with his shotgun raised at Philip, and Philip, startled by the sudden sound of Brian's warning cry, springs to his feet. Weaponless, glancing nervously from the wriggling woman to the duffel bag lying in the toadstools next to her, Philip raises his hands. "Put that goddamn thing down, Nicky." Nick raises the bead of the muzzle until it's trained directly on Philip. "Devil's got his hooks in you, Philip. You've sinned against God, desecrated his name. It's in the hands of the Lord now." Brian is staggering into the clearing, fumbling for his .38, hyperventilating with adrenaline. "Nick, don't do it." Brian's mind races as he comes to a halt 10 feet behind Nick. By this point, the girl on the ground has managed to roll over, still bound and gagged, and she's crying into the moist earth, as if wishing it would open up and let her climb in and die. Meanwhile, Nick and Philip are standing 6 feet away from each other, their gazes locked. "What are you, the avenging angel?" Philip asks his longtime friend. "Maybe I am." "This doesn't concern you, Nicky." Nick is trembling with emotion, his eyes blinking away tears. "There's a better place for you and your daughter, Philly." Philip stands as still as a stone monument, his narrow, weathered face looking positively grotesque in the gloomy light. "And I suppose you're the one who's gonna send me and Penny to glory. Somebody's gotta stop this, Philly. Might as well be me." Nick raises the sight to his eye and mutters, "Lord, please forgive." "Nick, wait! Please, listen to me." Brian circles around with the .38 pointed up in the air like he's a referee. He comes within inches of Nick, who still has his sight fixed on Philip. Brian babbles. "All the years of bumming around Waynesboro, all the laughs you shared, all the miles we put behind us, doesn't that count for something? Philip saved our lives. Things have gotten out of hand, yeah, but things can be put back together. Put the gun down, Nick. I'm begging you." Nick shakes. He keeps the sight fixed, sweat beads on his forehead. Philip takes a step closer. "Don't worry about it, Brian. Nicky's always been a talker. He ain't got the stones to shoot someone who's still alive." Nick trembles furiously. Brian watches, frozen with indecision. Philip calmly reaches down to the girl, grabs her by the scruff of her collar, and yanks her up like a stray piece of luggage. He turns and starts dragging the squirming girl towards the far side of the clearing. Nick's voice drops into a lower register. "Have mercy on us all." The shotgun ratchets suddenly, and the muzzle roars. A 12-gauge shotgun is a blunt instrument. The lethal, .33 caliber pellets can spread as wide as a foot or more in a short distance, tearing through its target with enough force to penetrate a cinder block. The buckshot that hits Philip in the back eviscerates him, and the grains also hit the girl, killing her instantly. The pair tumble forward in a tangled clinch before sprawling side by side on the forest floor. The girl is already stone still dead, but Philip twitches in his death throes for several agonizing seconds. His face is upturned, frozen in a mask of utter surprise. He tries to breathe, but the damage to his brain is shutting everything down. The shock of what has just happened drives Nick Parsons to his knees, his fingers still frozen on the trigger pad, the shotgun sizzling hot. His vision tunnels as he gazes at the damage inflicted on the two human bodies in the path of the blast. He drops the shotgun in the weeds and moves his mouth, but makes no sound. What has he done? He feels himself contracting inward like a seed pod, cold and desolate, the clanging noise of Armageddon ringing in his ears, the scalding tears of shame coming now in rivulets down his face. What has he done? Brian Blake turns to ice. His pupils dilate. The sight of his brother lying in a bloody heap on the ground next to the dead girl stamps itself forever on his brain. All other thoughts drain out of his mind. Only the noise of Nick's keening wails penetrate Brian's stupor. Howling with sobs now, Nick is still on his knees next to Brian. All reason and sanity have drained out of Nick Parsons' face, and he caterwauls at the sight of the carnage. Bursts of gibberish come out of him in stringers of snot, part prayer, part insane pleading, his breath showing in the chill twilight. He looks up at the heavens. Brian raises the .38 without thinking, a jolt of psychotic rage driving him, and he squeezes off a single shot, point blank, into the side of Nick Parsons' skull. Nick folds, eyes rolling back, brain already dead. He lands with the profound surrender of a child going to sleep. The passage of time loses all meaning. Brian doesn't see the dark silhouettes of figures approaching through the distant trees, drawn to the noise. Nor does he have any awareness of moving across the clearing to the mangled pair of bodies. But somehow, without being conscious of it, Brian Blake ends up on the ground next to Philip, cradling his younger brother's bloody form in his lap. He gazes down at Philip's grizzled face, now as pale as alabaster, stippled with blood. A flicker of life still glints in Philip's eyes, as the two brothers meet each other's gaze. For a brief instant, Brian flinches at the glacier of sorrow cutting through him. The connection between the two siblings is thick as blood, as deep as the earth, now fracturing Brian's soul with the power of shifting tectonic plates. The weight of their common history, the endless tedium of grammar school, the blessed summer vacations, the passing of late-night whispers from one bunk bed to the other, their first beers on that ill-fated Appalachian camping trip, their secrets, their fights, their small-town dreams foiled by life's cruel equations, all of it slices through his soul. Brian weeps. His cries, as shrill and keen as that of an animal in a trap, rise up into the darkening sky, blending with the distant whining of race cars. He sobs so hard he doesn't even notice Philip's passing. When Brian looks back down at his brother, Philip's face has hardened into a marble white sculpture. The foliage trembles 20 feet away. At least a dozen biters of all shapes and sizes are forcing their way through the thicket. The first one, an adult male in tattered work clothes, pops through the branches with arms reaching at the nothingness, shoe-button eyes scanning the clearing. The thing fixes its gaze on the closest meal, Philip's cooling corpse. Brian Blake rises to his feet and turns away. He can't watch. He knows this is the best option, the only option. Let the zombies clean up the mess. He shoves the .38 back behind his belt and heads for the construction site. Brian finds a perch on top of a truck cab to wait out the feeding frenzy. His brain is a television tuned to many stations all at once. He draws his pistol and clutches it like a security blanket. The cacophony of voices, the fragments of half-formed images, all crackle and flicker inside Brian's skull. The twilight has passed into full-bore darkness, the closest vapor lights hundreds of yards off. But Brian sees the world around him in photonegative brilliance now. His fear is keen as a knife edge. He's alone now, as alone as he has ever been, and it eats at him deeper than any zombie. Through the lacing of brambles and foliage, Brian can see the silhouettes of monsters tearing into the human remains left in the clearing. Brian closes his eyes. For a moment, he wonders if he should offer a silent eulogy for his brother, for Nick, and the woman, for Penny, for Bobby Marsh, for David Chalmers, for the dead, for the living, and for this whole up, broken, God-forsaken world. But he doesn't. He simply sits there as the zombies feed. Sometime later, God only knows when, the biters drift away. Brian slips off the roof of the truck cab and makes his way back through the darkness to the apartment. That night, Brian sits in the empty apartment, in the living room, in front of the empty, scummy fish tank. It's the end of the programming day in Brian's brain. The national anthem has been sung, the broadcast is signed off, and now only a blizzard of white noise blankets his thoughts. Still clad in his filthy jacket, he sits staring through the fish tank's rectangular glass side, which is filmed in green mold and mottled with specks of chum, as though watching some monotonous still life being broadcast from hell. He sits this way, staring trance-like into the vacuous heart of that fish tank for endless minutes. The minutes turn into hours. His mind screen is a blank cathode ray tube, boiling with electronic snow. The coming of daylight barely registers. He doesn't hear the commotion outside the apartment, the troubled voices, the sounds of vehicles. The day drags on, time now meaningless, until the next evening draws its curtain of darkness down over the apartment. Brian sits in the dark, oblivious to the passage of time, continuing to stare with catatonic interest at the invisible broadcast originating from the empty shell of the fish tank. The next morning comes and goes. At some point that next day, Brian blinks. The flicker of a message sparks and splutters across the blank screen of his mind. At first, it's faint and garbled, like a poorly transmitted signal. But with each passing second, it grows stronger, clearer, louder. Goodbye. Like a depth charge in the center of his soul, the word implodes in a convulsion of white-hot energy, jerking him forward in the shop-worn armchair, sitting him bolt upright, forcing open his eyes. Goodbye. He's dehydrated and stiff, his stomach empty, his pants soaked through with his own urine. For nearly 36 hours, he sat in that chair, comatose, as still as a divining rod, and moving isn't easy at first, but he feels cleansed, scourged, as clear-headed as he's ever been. He limps into the kitchen and finds little in the cupboard other than a couple of cans of peaches. He tears one open and wolfs the whole thing down, the juice running across his chin. Peaches have never tasted so good. In fact, it occurs to him that perhaps he has never tasted peaches before. He goes into the bedroom and changes out of his disgusting clothes, puts on his only other pair of jeans and his only other shirt, an AC/DC silkscreen tee. He finds his spare Doc Marten boots and slips them on. Mounted on the back of the door is a cracked, floor-length mirror. A wiry, disheveled compact ferret of a man stares back at him. The crack in the looking glass bisects his narrow visage and his thatch of long, unruly black hair. His face is fringed with straggly whiskers, his eyes sunken and rimmed in dark circles. He hardly recognizes himself. Whatever, he says to the mirror, and walks out of the room. He finds his .38 in the living room, along with one last speed loader, the last 6 rounds in his possession, and he shoves the gun down the back of his belt, the speed loader into his pocket. Then he visits Penny. "Hey there, kiddo," he says with great tenderness as he enters the laundry room. The narrow chamber of linoleum reeks of the dead. Brian barely notices the smell. He goes over to the little creature, who growls and sputters at his presence, straining against her chains. She's the color of cement, her eyes like smooth stones. Brian crouches down in front of her, looks in her bucket. It's empty. He looks up at her. "You know I love you, right?" The penny thing snarls. Brian strokes the side of her delicate little ankle. "I'm going to get some supplies, sweetheart. I'll be back before you know it. Don't worry." The little dead thing cocks its head and lets out a groan that sounds like air running through rusty pipes. Brian pats her on the leg, out of the range of her rotting incisors, and then rises to his feet. "See you soon, sweetie." The moment that Brian slips unnoticed from the side door of the apartment and starts north, striding through the raw winds of the afternoon, his head down, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, he can tell something is going on. The racetrack is silent. A couple of townspeople run past him, their eyes aglow with alarm. The air reeks of the dead. Off to the left, behind the barricade of buses and semis, scores of walking corpses wander along the barrier, sniffing for a way in. Up ahead, black smoke pours out of the clinic's incinerator. Brian quickens his pace. As he closes in on the town square, he can see, way in the distance, at the north end of the safe zone, where the fence is under construction, men standing on wooden parapets with rifles and binoculars. They don't look happy. Brian hurries along. All his pain, the stiffness in his joints, the throb in his ribs, vanishes amid the high-voltage current of his adrenaline. Woodbury keeps its food rations in a brick warehouse across from the old courthouse. Brian pauses in front of the warehouse when he sees the old derelict juicers loitering across the street in front of the flagstone government building with its chipped Romanesque columns. Other folks stand on the stone steps, nervously smoking cigarettes, while others crowd the entranceway. Brian crosses the intersection and approaches the gathering. "What's going on?" he asks the old man in the Salvation Army coat. "Trouble in River City, son," the old codger says, jerking a greasy thumb at the courthouse. "Half the town's in there having a powwow." "What happened?" "Found 3 more residents out in the woods yesterday, picked clean as chicken bones. Place is crawling with roamers now, drawn by the racetrack most likely. Damn fools making all that noise." For a moment, Brian considers his options. He could very easily avoid this mess, pack up, and move on. He could boost one of the four-wheelers and take Penny in the back and be gone in a flash. He doesn't owe these people anything. The safest bet is to not get involved, just get the fuck out of Dodge. That's the smartest way to play it, but something deep inside Brian makes him reconsider. What would Philip do? Brian stares at the crowd of townspeople milling about the entrance to the courthouse. Horror. Horror beyond imagining is what this new world dominated by death and the creatures who consume all life in their path breeds. And through horror is born ever more horror. After witnessing the death of his niece, his brother, and murdering a longtime family friend, Brian has undergone a change that transforms him into nothing short of a monster. Rationalizing that men like Brian are doomed to perish in such a treacherous world, what would Philip do doesn't just become Brian's mantra, but his entire persona. As in the wake of all the trauma he's had to witness in the span of less than 2 months, Brian decides to forge himself into a mirror image of his brother, solidifying his new life after he takes it upon himself to murder a man who was trying to set himself up as tyrant of Woodbury, Major Gene Gavin, becoming the new leader of Woodbury and setting him on a course that would see Brian, now Philip, commit and enable monstrous acts of evil, his first being the imprisonment of Gavin's men beneath the town's racetrack for later use. When a woman named Lily Call and her group of friends that includes Josh Hamilton, Megan Lafferty, Scott Moon, and Bob Stuckey arrive in Woodbury a month following this incident, we're given our first view of how the newly minted Philip Blake has ordered his kingdom and himself. Lily describes the new Brian Blake thusly in her first encounter with him. "Welcome, folks. Welcome to Woodbury." The voice that emanates from the doorway is low, nasally, and filled with faux conviviality. All heads turn. 3 men stand in the doorway with smiles on their faces that don't match their cold, lidded stares. The man in the middle radiates a weird kind of energy that makes Lily think of peacocks and fighting fish. "We can always use more good people around here," he says, and steps into the room. Lean and raw-boned in his ratty fisherman sweater, his cinder black hair shapeless and shaggy, he sports a 5 o'clock shadow of whiskers on his face that he's already trimming and styling into the beginnings of a Fu Manchu mustache. He has a strange nervous tic that is hardly noticeable. He blinks a lot. Now that tic is an interesting development, as perhaps it's meant to reflect Brian's now ongoing struggle with his new persona and his former self. But aside from this possibility, we can see that Brian has not just taken Philip's name and personality, but his appearance as well. In his new capacity as leader of Woodbury, Brian has taken on the moniker of the governor and has set about ordering the affairs of Woodbury to the best of his abilities. He enacts a barter system where one can trade anything for goods, including their bodies, oversees the construction of the various walls that keep the walkers out, and generally returns some semblance of normalcy to the lives of Woodbury's 50-plus inhabitants. On the surface, Woodbury under the governor's care seems like the ideal place to take refuge from the apocalypse. But aside from the fact that the governor has taken on his deceased brother's mission of preserving the reanimated Penny as best he can, the governor does much to promote the behavior he believes safeguards people from this new horrific world, the brutal and callous behavior that the real Philip Blake would have promoted. This is exemplified in characters like the Butcher, a nasty man in charge of the town's food stores that abuses the barter system for his own gain and harries his fellow citizens at any chance he's given, showing us that the governor has encouraged people to become the brutal monsters he now believes are required to make it through the apocalypse, or in the case of one of Lily Call's companions, Bob Stuckey, manipulated them into becoming like him. On the other side of the racetrack complex, beneath the north end of the arena, a wiry, tightly coiled individual emerges from an unmarked metal door and gazes up at the sky. The rain has ceased for the moment, leaving behind a low ceiling of sooty clouds. The wiry gentleman carries a small bundle wrapped in a threadbare woolen blanket the color of dead grass, gathered at the top with rawhide. The wiry man crosses the street and starts down the sidewalk, his raven black hair slick with moisture and pulled back in a ponytail today. As he walks, his preternaturally alert gaze is everywhere, practically all at once, taking in everything that goes on around him. In recent weeks, the emotions that have plagued him have subsided, the voice in his head silent now. He feels strong. This town is his raison d'etre, the fuel that keeps him keen and sharp. He is about to turn the corner at the intersection of Canyon and Main when he notices a figure in his peripheral vision. The drunk guy who came in a few days ago with a black man and the girls is emerging from the warehouse at the south end of the racetrack. The weathered old dude pauses for a moment to take a gulp from his flask, and the look on his face after swallowing and cringing at the burn is apparent to the wiry man even a block away. In the distance, the older dude grimaces as the alcohol streams down his gullet, and the grimace is weirdly familiar to the wiry man. The grimace, full of shame and desolation, makes the wiry man feel strange and sentimental, almost tender. The older man puts the flask away and starts trundling toward Main Street with that trademark gait, half limp, half drunken amble, which many homeless people get after years of struggling on the streets. The wiry man follows. Minutes later, the wiry man cannot resist calling out to the juicer, "Hey sport!" Bob Stuckey hears the voice, gravelly, lightly accented with a trace of southern small town, echoing on the breeze, but he cannot locate the source. "Bob, is it?" the voice says, closer now, and Bob finally sees a figure approaching from behind. "Oh, hi. How you doing?" The man saunters up to Bob with a forced smile. "I'm doing great, Bob. Thanks." Wisps of coal-black hair dangling in front of the man's chiseled face, he carries a bundle that seems to be leaking moisture, dripping on the pavement. People around town have started to call this man the governor. The name is stuck, which is fine and dandy with this guy. "How you setting into our little hamlet?" "Real good." "You meet Doc Stevens?" "Yes, sir." "Good man." "Call me the governor." The smile softens a bit. "Everybody else seems to be calling me that." What the hell? Kinda like the ring of it. The governor it is, Bob says, and glances down at the bundle in the man's grip. The blanket leaks blood. Bob glances away quickly, alarmed by it, but feigning ignorance. Looks like the rains have blown over. The man's smile remains stamped on his face. Walk with me, Bob. Sure. They start down the cracked sidewalk, moving toward the temporary wall that stands between Merchants Row and the outer streets. The sound of nail guns snapping can be heard above the wind. The wall continues expanding along the southern edge of the business district. You remind me of somebody, the governor says after a long pause. I'm betting it ain't Kate Winslet. Bob has had enough alcohol to loosen his tongue. He chuckles to himself as he trundles along. Or Bonnie Raitt neither. Touché, Bob. The governor glances down at his package, notices the droplets of blood leaving little coin-sized marks on the sidewalk. What a mess I'm making. Bob looks away, scrambles to change the subject. Ain't y'all worried about all that pounding racket over there drawing walkers? We got it under control, Bob. Don't you worry about that. Got men posted out on the edge of the woods, and we try and keep the pounding down to a minimum. That's good to hear. Got things figured out pretty good around here. We try, Bob. You're looking at my little bundle, aren't you, Bob? No, sir. Whatever it is, it's none of my beeswax. Doesn't concern me. My place is just up the road a piece, the governor says with a tilt of his head toward the east side of town. Little two-story apartment building. Come on over. I'll fix you a drink. The governor's mansion, Bob jokes. He can't help it. The nerves and the booze are working on him. Ain't you got laws to pass? The governor pauses, turns, and smiles at Bob. I just figured out who you remind me of. In that brief instant, standing in that gray overcast daylight, the wiry man, who from this point on shall think of himself as the governor, experiences a seismic shift within his brain. He stands there staring at a coarse, deeply lined alcoholic good old boy from Smyrna, who is the spitting image of Ed Blake, the governor's old man. Ed Blake had that same pug nose, prominent brow, and crow's feet around red-rimmed eyes. Ed Blake was a big drinker too, like this guy, with the same sense of humor. Ed Blake would toss off sarcastic one-liners with the same drunken relish, cutting to the quick with his words when he wasn't slapping his family around with the back of his big, calloused hands. All at once, another part of the governor bubbles up to the surface, a deeply buried part of him, on a wave of sentimental longing, which almost makes him dizzy as he remembers Big Ed Blake in happier times. A simple hillbilly laborer who tried to fight his demons long enough to be a loving father. You remind me of somebody I used to know a long time ago, the governor says finally, his tone softening as he looks Bob Stookie in the eyes. Come on, let's go get a drink. For the rest of their journey across the safe zone, the two men talk quietly, openly, like old friends. At one point, the governor asked Bob what happened to his wife. Place we lived, this mobile home park, Bob says slowly, heavily, as he hobbles along remembering dark days. We got overrun one day with walkers. I was out trying to scrounge up some supplies when it happened. By the time I got back, they had gotten into our place. He pauses and the governor says nothing, just walks in silence, waiting. They were tearing into her, and I fought them off best I could. And I guess they only ate enough of her that she came back. Another agonizing pause. Bob licks his dry lips. The governor can see that the man needs a drink badly, needs his medicine to staunch the memories. I couldn't bring myself to finish her off. This comes out of Bob on a choked wheeze. His roomy eyes well up. I ain't proud of the fact that I left her. Pretty sure she got some folks after that. Her arm and her lower body was pretty mangled, but she could still get around. Them people she got, their deaths are my fault. A pause. It's hard to let go sometimes. The governor ventures at last, glancing down at his ghastly little bundle. The dripping has diminished somewhat. Right then, the governor notices Bob pondering the blood droplets, his brow furrowed in thought. He looks almost sober. Bob gestures at the gruesome bundle. You got somebody turned on ya, don't ya? You're not so dumb, are ya, Bob? Bob wipes his mouth pensively. Never thought about feeding Brenda. Come on, Bob. I want to show you something. They reach the two-story brick edifice at the end of the block, and Bob follows the governor inside. Stand behind me for a second, Bob. The governor fiddles a key into a deadbolt, the door at the end of a second-floor hallway. The door clicks, and the sound of a low growl seeps out. I would appreciate it, Bob, if you kept what you're about to see to yourself. No problem. Lips are sealed. Bob follows the governor into a two-bedroom unit with Spartan furnishings that reek of spoiled meat and disinfectant, the windows painted over with black Rust-Oleum. A floor-length mirror near the front vestibule is covered with newspaper and masking tape. The mirror in the bathroom, visible through an open doorway, is missing, its absence evident in the pale oval outline above the sink. All the mirrors in this place have been removed. She's everything to me, the governor says. Bob follows the man across the living room, down a short hallway, and through a doorway into a cramped laundry room, where the upright corpse of a little girl is chained to a U-bolt drilled into the wall. Oh Lord. Bob keeps his distance. The dead girl, still in pigtails and pinafore dress as if dressed for church, snarls and spits and flails, her chain straining at its mooring. Bob takes a step back. Oh Lord. Calm down, Bob. The governor kneels in front of the pint-sized zombie and lays the bundle on the floor. The girl bites at the air, blackened teeth clacking. The governor unwraps a human head. Oh my. This here's Penny. She's an only child. We came from a small town called Waynesboro. Penny's mother, my sweet wife Sarah, was killed in a car crash before the turn. The child feeds. Bob watches from the doorway, at once appalled and riveted, as the diminutive zombie eats her meal. The governor watches the feeding. My brother Brian and I, along with a few friends of mine, we set out to find greener pastures with Penny here. Made our way west, crashed in Atlanta for a spell, hooked up with some people, lost some people, kept moving west. The little corpse settles down. The governor's voice drops an octave. Had a run-in with some dirtbags in an orchard not far from here. His words falter for a moment. No tears, but his voice crumbles a little. Put my brother in charge of Penny while I fended him off, and one thing led to another. Bob cannot move. He cannot speak in this airless chamber of stained tiles, exposed plumbing, and mold-darkened grout. He watches the tiny abomination, her ghastly face content now. My brother fucked up big time. Got my baby killed. The governor explains now, his head down, his chin on his chest. His voice gets thick with emotion. Brian was weak, and that's all there is to it. I couldn't let it go, though. He looks at Bob through raw, wet eyes. I know you can relate, Bob. I could not let go of my baby girl. Bob can relate. His chest seizes up with sorrow for Brenda. I blame myself for Penny getting killed and coming back. The governor stares at the floor. I kept her going with scraps, and we kept heading west. By the time we got to Woodbury, my brother Brian was apeshit crazy with guilt. I had to put Brian down like a sick dog, the governor utters, almost to himself. He takes a step closer to the little thing that used to be a child. His voice becomes almost toneless. I still see my Penny in there sometimes, when she's calm like this. Bob swallows hard. Contrary emotions swirl and eddy inside him. Repulsion, sadness, fear, bone-deep longing, even sympathy for this deranged individual. And he hangs his head. You've been through a lot. Look at that, Bob. The governor nods toward the little zombie. The child thing cocks its head, staring at the governor with a vexed expression. The thing blinks its eyes. My baby's still in there, aren't you, honey? The governor goes over to the chained creature, kneels and strokes its livid cheek. Bob stiffens, starts to say, "Be careful. You don't want to be... Here's my beautiful baby girl." The governor strokes the thing's matted hair. The tiny zombie blinks. The pallid face changes, eyes narrowing, blackened lips peeling away from rotten baby teeth. Bob steps forward. Look out! The penny thing snaps its jaws at the exposed flesh of the governor's wrist, but the governor pulls away just in time. Whoopsie! The little zombie strains at its chain, scuttling to its feet and reaching at the air as the governor backs away. He speaks in baby talk. Wascally Wabbit almost got daddy that time. Bob gets woozy. He can feel his gorge rising, the bile threatening to come up. Bob, do me a favor and reach into that loose bundle that the head came out of. Huh? Do me a favor and grab that last little goodie in that bag over there. Bob holds his vomit in and turns and finds the bundle on the floor and looks inside. A pale human finger, apparently male, lies at the bottom of the bag in a clot of drying blood. Something loosens inside Bob, as sudden as a rubber band snapping, as he pulls a handkerchief from his pocket, bends down, and retrieves the finger. Why don't you do the honors, my friend? The governor suggests, standing proudly over the snapping zombie child, his hands on his hips. Bob feels as though his body has begun to move on its own, with a mind of its own. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Bob stands within inches of the chain's limit, as the penny thing snarls and sputters noisily at him, clanging against the U-bolt. Yeah, why not? Holding the finger out at arm's length, Bob feeds it to the creature. The little corpse gobbles the thing. The two men stand side by side, watching now. The governor puts his arm around his new friend. Now, it's excerpts like these that not only show us the ongoing struggle Brian has with his new persona, but how he's now become a predator who expertly plays on the desires of others to fortify his position and transform people into tools with which he can do as he wills. And he's aided in no small part by a significant amount of charisma that he's managed to develop upon his transformation. Bob isn't the only person from Lily's group who falls victim to the governor's antics or the system he's created, though. In fact, what happens to each member of that group only further highlights how terrifying of a man the governor and what he's created is. Megan and Scott arrived as a couple, and shortly after their arrival, the two potheads would separate to explore the town. Scott ended up helping the governor with a task he needed doing, as we can see here in the governor special, tagging along with him to the local Walmart to help the governor carry back a bunch of fish tanks to his apartment. Now, most of you who are familiar with the story will already know this, but the governor needed these fish tanks so he could start a little side project of his, amassing a collection of walker heads to keep in his home that he could stare at for hours to harden himself. And once Scott is finished helping the governor, he announces that Scott's head is going to be the first to adorn his walls, and he promptly kills him. With Scott missing, Megan becomes despondent and lonely, and to feed her desire for mind-altering substances, she chooses to participate in the barter system by selling her body to any interested parties. Now, Megan and Lily once considered themselves best friends, but as Megan's behavior began to err on the deplorable, Lily chose to distance herself from her, and with her friend and lover both abandoning her, Megan's mental health only fell further as she further immersed herself in selling her body, something that was certainly her choice, but a choice that was made because there was a system in place that heavily incentivized women like Megan participating in these activities, even if it were something they wouldn't have ordinarily engaged in. This eventually drives Megan to attempt to make a deal for more drugs by propositioning the governor, an act which culminates in a fear-laden assault that's only made worse by the fact that the governor chose to take her in the room where he keeps his heads, with the severed head of her former lover in full view, as this disgusting man violates her. After they finish, and Megan is begging for her life, fearing that the governor might kill her because of what she's seen, the governor declares that she now belongs to Bob, as Bob had mentioned to the governor that he fancied Megan, and the governor assured him that somehow she would be his. Megan then leaves and heads over to Bob's place, where she admits to him everything she's seen, passing out in his arms in a heap of emotional exhaustion. When Bob wakes up, though, he discovers that Megan has hung herself, the sad loss of a woman who was abused by a horrendous man and the system he created, a loss that also causes despondency in Bob, driving him to drown himself further in alcohol than he already had been. That is in itself a slow but accelerated march to the end of his life. The last member of Lily's group, aside from Lily herself, Josh Hamilton, also ends up becoming a victim of the governor's system. The horrid man that I'd mentioned earlier who runs the town's food stores, Sam the Butcher, was in the habit of manipulating people's labor and desire for goods for his own gain, granting people loans of goods in exchange for debts that needed to be repaid either through more goods or their own labor. And in Josh's case, Sam continuously upped his debt or changed the parameters of their agreement to keep Josh in perpetual debt to him. After Lily and Josh make a supply run outside of town and return with their loot in tow, they run into Sam, and Sam demands that what they've acquired be given to him so he can apply it to Josh's debt. Josh, who's fed up with Sam's scummy ways, decides to push Sam away when he tries to grab the bag he's carrying. When Josh is walking away, Sam chooses to take his gun out and shoot Josh in the back of his head. Now, is the governor responsible for the actions of a man like Sam? Yes and no. Sam chose to take out that gun and shoot Josh, and he chose to engage in his skeevy practices, but the governor certainly enabled him to do so. And as I said earlier, he promotes this kind of behavior in his people because he believes that's the best way to survive in these trying times. So both Sam and the governor are culpable here. Now, what all of this shows us is the fact that it's not just the governor as a person that's reprehensible, but everything that he represents. One of the main forces opposed to the governor's actions in this story is the town doctor, Dr. Stevens, and he makes a comment at one point that it's not the walkers that one needs to worry about in Woodbury, it's the people. And while individuals are still responsible for their actions, we can surely attribute all the blame for their darker actions being allowed to flourish to the governor. What may surprise even Brian Blake, though, is the fact that the governor is a more sinisterly effective leader than he could have ever dreamed, as these types of actions show us that the governor is keenly aware of human nature and how best to take advantage of people's fears and desires, which is further expounded upon when the governor witnesses two of his men fighting in the streets, with a crowd of onlookers cheering them on. The governor realizes in this moment that to prevent unrest from forming in a society, humans need something to distract them from the everyday horrors they're forced to experience, which is even more important in a day and age where horror is liable to occur at any second. When the governor arrived in Woodbury, the inhabitants were fond of using a local racetrack to conduct car races, but knowing that the roar of these engines circling around a track would only draw in more walkers, the governor put a stop to this practice when he took over. While things were relatively stable in Woodbury when he witnessed this fight, the governor on some level must have been aware that things weren't guaranteed to stay that way, no matter whether he kept the walkers out or not. And so the classically educated governor took to heart the phrase, bread and circuses, a term coined by the Roman poet Juvenal in the 2nd century AD. Already long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties. For the people who once upon a time handed out military command, high civil office, legions, everything, now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things, bread and circuses. With ample food supplies, access to electricity, rudimentary medical care, and a secure environment. All he needed now to keep his people complacent and loyal to a fault was a little entertainment. And so began the gladiatorial-style fights in the former racetrack. Now over time, they'd be performed by willing participants who put on a show that's more akin to brutal professional wrestling matches more than anything else. But to get the party started, the governor decided to use it as a form of punishment. I mentioned earlier that the governor had imprisoned the men loyal to Major Gavin beneath the racetrack. 6 men named Tommy Zorn, Manning, Johnson, Greeley, Trey Barker, and Stinson. The governor had them locked in a dark room and chained to the walls, periodically visiting them to torture them in any way that he pleased. He had already murdered 2 of them, Johnson and Greeley, so they could be chopped up and used to feed Penny. But a few days prior to the street fight's occurrence, Trey had hatched a plan to play dead so the remaining 4 men could ambush the governor when he entered the cell to check on them. And after a brief struggle, the governor ends up foiling their plot and murders Trey. The remaining 3 are then later taken to the arena to fight, with Manning and Tommy both falling to each other, and Stinson fighting against Sam the Butcher, whom he killed during the fight. Now, as a macabre form of justice, pitting the guilty against each other in an arena is about as barbaric as it comes. Sam certainly deserves some form of punishment, even if the way in which he was punished isn't something that should be condoned. But the 3 men who had aligned themselves to Gavin were essentially prisoners of war. And while the appropriate punishment for being on the wrong side of a conflict can be debated, it probably shouldn't be something like this. This is just a testament to the cruel genius of the governor, ironing out the kinks of his new extracurricular activity by eliminating threats and giving people a show at the same time. And he even gets a chance to make the town safer using the only survivor from the arena, Stinson, as bait for walkers that he and his men mow down as they devour Stinson in the back of his trailer, all of which further solidifies his hold on the citizens of Woodbury. But not all is well in paradise, for all the misfortune we just discussed pushes Lily Call into organizing an effort to take the governor down, and they almost succeed in eliminating him after they kidnap him and attempt to take him outside of town to feed him to the walkers. Unfortunately for the conspirators though, a huge herd of walkers ambushes the van they're carrying the governor in, and after they're eliminated, the governor and his men manage to get the upper hand and turn the tables on Lily and co. This is another moment where the governor's intelligence shines through, as rather than executing these driven people or feeding them to the walkers, he chooses to spare them if they swear fealty to him. The time it takes Bruce to go fetch the doctor and Alice is interminable for Lily. Sitting next to Martinez, she expects a bullet to come smashing through her skull at any moment. She can feel Gabe's body heat behind her, only inches away. She can smell his BO and hear his thick breathing, but he doesn't say a word the whole time they're waiting, nor does Martinez speak, nor does the governor, who continues to pace across the front of the room. Lily doesn't care about dying anymore. Something inexplicable has happened to her. She thinks of Josh rotting in the ground, and she feels nothing. She thinks about Megan hanging by that makeshift noose, and it stirs 0 emotion. She thinks of Bob sinking into oblivion. None of it matters anymore. The worst part is, she knows the governor is right. They need a Rottweiler on these walls. They need a monster to staunch the blood tide. Across the room, the door clicks, and Bruce returns with Stevens and Alice. The doctor enters in his wrinkled lab coat, walking a few feet in front of Bruce's gun. Alice brings up the rear. "Come on in and join the party," the governor greets them with an icy smile. "Have a seat. Relax. Take a load off. Sit a spell." Without a word, the doctor and Alice cross the room and sit down on folding chairs next to Martinez and Lily, like children sent to their rooms. The doctor says nothing, just stares at the floor. "So the whole gang's here now," the governor says, coming over to the foursome. He stands inches away, a coach about to give a halftime chalk talk. "Here's the thing. We're going to strike a little agreement. A verbal contract. Very simple. Look at me, Martinez." It requires Herculean effort for Martinez to look up at the dark-eyed man. The governor latches his gaze onto Martinez. "The agreement is this. As long as I keep the fucking wolves from the door, keep the gravy boats full around here, you don't ask questions about how I do it." He pauses, standing in front of them waiting, his hands on his hips, his blood-caked features grim and set, his gaze meeting each of their traumatized stares. Nobody says anything. Lily sees herself springing to her feet and kicking her chair over and screaming at the top of her lungs and grabbing one of the rifles and cutting the governor down in a storm of gunfire. She stares at the floor. The silence stretches. "One more thing," the governor says, smiling at them, his eyes dead and mirthless. "Anybody breaches this contract, sticks their nose in my business, Martinez dies, and the rest of you get banished to the sticks. You got that?" He waits in silence. "Answer me, you cocksuckers. You understand the stipulations of our contract? Martinez?" The reply comes on a haggard breath. "Yeah." "I can't hear you." Martinez looks at him. "Yeah, I understand. How about you, Stevens?" "Yes, Philip." The doctor's voice drips with contempt. "Great closing argument. You should be a lawyer." "Alice?" She gives him a quick, jittery nod. The governor looks at Lily. "How about you? Are we clear on this?" Lily looks at the floor, says nothing. The governor presses in closer. I'm not getting a consensus here. I'll ask you again, Lily. You understand the agreement? Lily refuses to speak. The governor draws his pearl-handed .45 Army Colt, snaps back the slide, and presses the muzzle to her head. But before he can say another word or send a bullet into her brain, Lily looks up at him. I understand. Ladies and gentlemen, the nasally voice of the farm kid crackles through the arena's PA system, echoing out over the chaotic scene behind the chain-link barrier. The tight knot of spectators is scattered across the stands, although not a single audience member has departed the stadium. Some of them lie on their backs, drunk, staring at the moonless night sky. Others pass bottles of hooch back and forth, attempting to numb the horrors of the mayhem they have just witnessed across the infield. Some of the drunker patrons are throwing trash and empty bottles into the arena, tormenting the captive biters. The two dead combatants lie in heaps just out of reach of the zombies, as the crowd jeers and catcalls. This has been going on for almost an hour. The amplified voice crackles. We have a special announcement for you from the governor. The news gets their attention, and the cacophony of yelps and whoops and whistles dies down. The 40 or so spectators awkwardly return to their front row seats, some of them tripping on drunken feet. Within minutes, the entire crowd is coalesced down front, behind the cyclone fence barricade that once protected race fans from spinouts and flaming tires flying off the track. Put your hands together for our fearless leader, the governor. From the middle gangway, like a ghost, the long-coated figure emerges from the shadows into the cold vapor of calcium lights. Blood stippled and muddy, his coattails flagging in the wind, a Trojan commander returning from the siege of Troy. Striding out to the center of the infield, standing amid the expired guardsmen, he whips the mic cord behind him, raises the mic, and booms into it. Friends, you are all here because of fate. Fate has brought us together, and it is our fate to survive this plague together. The crowd, most of them drunk, lets out an intoxicated cheer. It is also my fate to be your leader, and I accept that role with pride. And any son of a bitch who doesn't like it can come take it away. Anytime. You know where to find me. Any takers out there? Anybody got enough sand to keep this town safe? The drunken voices fade. The faces behind the chain link go slack. He's got their attention now. The wind in the high gantries punctuates the silence. Each and every one of you tonight shall bear witness to a new day in Woodbury. Tonight the barter system officially comes to an end. Now the silence grips the arena like a pall. The spectators do not expect this, their heads cocked as though hanging on every word. From now on, supplies will be gathered for the good of all, and they will be distributed equally. This is how people will earn their way into our community, by gathering supplies, by benefiting the common good. One older gentleman a few rows above the others stands on wobbly knees, his Salvation Army topcoat buffeting in the wind, and he begins to clap, nodding his head, his grizzled jaw jutting proudly. These policy changes will be strictly enforced. Anyone caught trading favors of any sort in return for goods will be forced to fight in the ring of death as punishment. The governor pauses, scanning the crowd, letting this sink in. We are not barbarians. We take care of our own. We are our brother's keepers. Now more and more of the onlookers stand and begin to applaud, some of them spontaneously sobering up, finding their voices, cheering as though in a church service responding to a hallelujah. The governor's sermon strikes a climactic chord. This will be a new era of Woodbury working together to form a happier, more cohesive community. By this point, nearly every spectator has risen to their feet, and the roar of their voices, a sound not unlike an old-fashioned tent revival meeting, reverberates up into the upper tiers and echoes across the night sky. People are clapping, hollering their approval, and exchanging glances of relief and pleasant surprise, and perhaps even hope. The fact is, from this distance, behind the cyclone fence, most of them glassy-eyed from drinking all night, the spectators do not notice the bloodthirsty glint behind the dark eyes of their benevolent leader. Now, everything that we've talked about so far in regard to the governor's actions and policies are as gruesome as they come, but that's nothing compared to what happens only a few months after this announcement. Things seem to be going well in Woodbury following the advent of the fighting arena, but things soon take a turn for the worse. It starts when a helicopter crashes in the woods near Woodbury. The governor sends a team to examine the wreckage, and when they arrive, they find that there's one woman still left alive, Christina. When she's taken back to Woodbury for medical treatment and to receive the welcome wagon from the governor, we learn as he speaks to her that she was from a news station out of North Atlanta, and after the governor has probed her for information about any supplies left where she's come from, he asks her if she'd like to become a citizen of Woodbury, an offer which she declines due to her being informed by Dr. Stevens of the governor's true nature before he came to speak with her. We've already talked about Dr. Stevens a bit, but he's another one of those people that the governor doesn't necessarily like, but needs because he has a valuable skill set that's hard to replace in this era of chaos and instability. Even so, the governor knows that Stevens is liable to undermine him at any point in any number of ways, and unfortunately for Christina, the doctor's actions here would seal her fate. Once Christina declines to live in Woodbury and cites Dr. Stevens' warning, the governor strangles her to death, afterwards putting the blame for her death on Dr. Stevens, citing his corruption of her against him as the reason why she needed to be eliminated as a potential threat, cowing Dr. Stevens into behaving for the time being lest he drive any other innocents into the governor's grip. Not long after this is when Rick, Michonne, and Glenn show up in Woodbury, and here is where things go from bad to exponentially worse. Just like with Christina, the governor welcomes the band into his town and takes them directly to his private box at the fighting arena. But unlike with Christina, the governor's welcome wagon makes an abrupt stop once they're locked in that room with him. After a short chat about where they've come from, the governor decides to enlighten them on how they keep the walkers they use as hazards in the arena from expiring or ravaging the contestants, declaring that to do so, they feed them strangers. The governor then proceeds to chop off Rick's hand, and then orders Michonne and Glenn to be imprisoned beneath the arena, but not before the governor loses an ear to Michonne in the struggle. The governor's goal here is simple. He wants the group to tell him where they've come from, so he can raid their supplies for the betterment of his town. Casualties be damned. Rick's dismemberment does little to convince him that he should give up the location of his friends and family though, so the governor decides to resort to other measures. After having Michonne securely tied up, the governor visits her and proceeds to assault and torture her all night long. And when she still refuses to tell him where the group have made their home, he returns the next day to repeat the process. Only this time, he makes sure that Glenn is moved into the cell next to hers so he can hear everything that he does to her. However, Michonne never wavers, and Glenn doesn't either, but the governor comes to a realization once he takes into account the fact that Rick and Glenn were clad in riot gear and orange jumpsuits, that they've come from a prison, and he confirms his suspicions by telling Rick of his hypothesis and seeing the look of horror on his face once he does. The only problem that he has now is finding this prison, so he enlists Martinez to break out the captives so they might lead him back to the prison, and after this, he heads over to see Michonne once again to offer her a deal. He explains to Michonne that one of his fighters that was scheduled to fight that night in the arena, Harold, was murdered by another one of his fighters, Eugene, and so he offers her a chance to fight in the arena in exchange for a quick death, and if she chooses not to, he ensures her that she'll be tortured until she expires anyway. His only stipulation here is that Michonne not kill the other fighter, but this is a moment of extreme stupidity on the governor's part, as he lets Michonne take her sword with her into the arena and still expects her to not kill her opponent, which she does of course. Enraged, the governor heads over to her cell with katana in hand ready to end her, incredulous that she would renege on their deal. But before he does something he'll regret, he decides to return home and sleep on it. And here is where we reach a very important milestone in the governor's life. Now, as gruesome as the governor's actions are, and as frightening as his increasing level of power is, the governor has always, and will always be an entity that was born from the mind of a broken man. And while trauma and tragedy are typically enough for one to develop into a psychopath, the forced onset of psychopathy that the governor is experiencing is the result of self-induced psychosis that is perpetually pushing his mental state over the edge. And while the Philip Blake persona he's adopted remains dominant, he still has moments where his true self plagues his mind and causes him to wonder how he could let himself become such a monster. Take these excerpts that were given after he assaults Megan and strangles Christina as examples. Minutes after Megan Lafferty makes her exit, vanishing into the shadows of the corridor, shivering and hyperventilating as she pulls on her coat, the governor retires to the side room. He flops down on his lazy boy and sits facing the matrix of fish tanks. He sits there for quite a while, staring at the tanks, feeling empty. Muffled groans drift through the empty rooms behind him. The thing that was once a little girl is hungry again. Nausea begins to creep up the governor's gorge, clenching his insides and making his eyes water. He begins to shake. A current of terror over what he's done crackles through him, turning his tendons to ice. A moment later, he lurches forward, slipping off the chair, falling on his knees, and roaring vomit. What is left of his dinner sluices across the filthy carpet. On his hands and knees, he upchucks the remaining contents of his stomach, then sits back against the foot of the chair, gasping for breath. A part of him, that deeply buried part known as Brian, feels the tide of revulsion drowning him. He can't breathe, he can't think, and yet he forces himself to keep gazing at the bloated, waterlogged faces staring back at him. He wants to look away, but he knows he must keep staring until his senses are numbed. He needs to be strong. He needs to be prepared for what is to come. Philip Blake steps back from the gurney on which the woman from Atlanta now lies dead. He catches his breath, inhaling and exhaling deeply, getting himself together. In some distant compartment of his brain, a faint voice objects and pushes back, but he stuffs it back down into that dark fractured place in his mind. He mutters to himself, his voice barely audible to his own ears, as though an argument is underway. Had to be done. I had no choice in the matter. No choice. Now, as we've already discussed, what brought on this change in personality was the immense amounts of trauma that Brian was forced to endure in short order. And well, it turns out that the only things that could further solidify his transformation was more trauma. After Martinez breaks out Rick, Glenn, and Michonne. Michonne decides to take a little detour before she returns to the prison. Heading over to the governor's apartment, Michonne engages in a struggle with him that sees her coming out the victor. Upon her victory, Michonne ties up the governor in the same way she was tied up, and she proceeds to unleash horrors upon him that he very much deserved. Now what Michonne does to the governor here is extremely gory, and I don't think I can get away with giving you the details here on YouTube, so I'll give you a brief toned-down overview. And if you'd like to get the full picture, I suggest that you go read either The Fall of the Governor or issue 33 of the Walking Dead comic. Essentially, Michonne nails Governor Jr. to the floor, takes a drill to his shoulder, removes some of his fingernails, removes one of his arms, cauterizes that wound, violates him with a bent spoon, removes one of his eyes with that same spoon, then cuts off Governor Jr. before she's forced to leave as his guards come to check on him. And through all this torture is where the governor finally overcomes his former self to fully encapsulate the beast that he's become. Here are the governor's thoughts during this process, as is laid out for us in The Fall of the Governor. The governor starts to hyperventilate, his heart kicking in his chest. He senses his inner voice, usually buried deep within the remotest cavities of his brain, bubbling to the surface and taking over and dominating his stream of consciousness. Oh God, I'm scared. What have I done? This is God paying me back. I never should have done those things I did to this woman, to the others, to Penny. I'm so damn scared. I can't breathe. I don't want to die. Please don't make me die. I don't want to die. Oh God. Shut the f up. Philip Blake silently howls at the voice in his head, the voice of Brian Blake, his weaker, softer self, as he stiffens and cringes against the ropes. Whoa there, cowboy. The woman smiles at him. I wouldn't do much moving if I were you. The governor lets his head droop and closes his eyes and lets out a thin breath through his nostrils. The gag holds tight on his mouth, a 4x4-inch hank of duct tape. He tries to moan, but he can't even do that. His vocal cords strangled by the pain and the war going on inside him. The Brian part of him is pushing its way back up through the layers until it insinuates itself again in the governor's forebrain. God, please, please, I did bad things, I know, but I don't deserve this. I don't want to die like this. I don't want to die like an animal, in this dark place. I'm so scared. I don't want to die. Please, I beg you, have mercy. I will plead with this woman. I will plead for my life, for mercy, for my life. Please, 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 please. Oh God, please. God, please! Philip Blake winces, his body convulsing, the rope digging into his wrists. Easy there, sport, the woman says to him, her glistening brown face almost sanguine in the shifting lights of the gently swaying lamp. I don't want you to pass out again before I get a chance to begin. Eyes slamming shut, lungs erupting with fire, the governor tamps down the voice, swallows it back, shoves it back into the dark convolutions of his brain. He silently roars at his other self. Stop your fucking whining, you little weak-willed fucking baby, and listen to me. Listen, listen, listen. You are not going to beg, and you're not going to fucking cry like a little fucking baby. You little baby! In the surreal passage of time before she comes back with a torch, lying on the floor in his own blood, the cold spreading through him, he senses the other voice way down in some far-flung cavity of his brain, sobbing and choking on its anguished plea. God, please don't let me die like this. Please, save me. Don't let it end. Not like this. I don't want to die like… Enough! Enough! Deep down in the core of his soul, Philip Blake turns a corner, the revelation traveling up his spine and exploding in his brain. It's time, he thinks, flinging his thoughts at her through the beacon of his feverish gaze. Go ahead. I'm ready. Get it over with. I dare you. Go ahead, bitch. I'm fucking ready to die. So kill me. Do it now. Kill me. I'll bet you don't have the fucking guts. Go ahead and kill me now, you fucking bitch. After Michonne finishes with her work, and the governor is kept alive by his henchmen, we receive the following scene that plays out in his mind. The fire starts on the first floor, the flames licking up the cabbage rose wallpaper, unfurling across the plaster ceiling, and spewing black, noxious smoke throughout the hallways and bedrooms of the Farrell Street house, blinding him, choking the breath out of him. He darts across the dining room, searching for the back stairs, finding them, hurling down the old, rickety wooden risers into the musty darkness of the basement. Philip? Philip! Philip! He lurches across the filthy, watermarked cement floor, frantically scanning the dark cellar for his brother. Upstairs, the home blazes and crackles, the conflagration roaring through the cluttered chambers of the meager bungalow, the heat pressing down on the foundation. He whirls fecklessly in circles, scanning the shadowy reaches of the smoke-bound cellar, batting away cobwebs and choking on the acrid smoke and ammonia-rot stench of rancid canned beets, rat turds, and ancient fiberglass insulation. He can hear the creaking and thudding of wooden timbers collapsing onto the floor above him as the maelstrom rages out of control, which makes no sense because his little childhood home in Waynesboro, Georgia, never burned down in any fire, as far as he can remember. But here it is, going up in a terrible inferno, and he can't find his brother. How did he get here? And where the is Philip? He needs Philip. God damn it, Philip. God damn it. Philip would know what to do. Philip! His hysterical cry comes out of him like a thin puff of air, a breathless chirp, a fading signal on a radio tuned to some distant station. All at once he sees a portal in one of the basement walls, a strange, concave opening like a hatch on a submarine, a weird greenish glow emanating from within it, and he realizes that the opening is new. There was never such an opening in the basement of his childhood home on Farrell Street, but again, like black magic, here it fucking is. He stumbles toward the dim, radiant green gash in the darkness. Pushing through the opening, he steps into an airless cinderblock garage stall. The chamber is empty. The walls bear the marks of torture, streaks of dark, drying blood, and the frayed ends of ropes affixed to U-bolts. And the place radiates evil. Pure, unadulterated, preternatural evil. He wants out. He can't breathe. His flesh crawls. He can't make a sound other than a faint mewling noise coming from the deepest part of his lungs, an anguished moaning. He hears a noise and spins around, and sees another gangrenous green glowing portal, and he lunges toward it. He goes through the opening, and he finds himself in a pine grove outside Woodbury. He recognizes the clearing, the deadfall logs forming a natural little amphitheater, the ground carpeted in matted pine needles, fungus, and weeds. His heart quickens. This is an even worse place, a death scene. A figure emerges from the forest and steps into the pale light. It's his old friend, Nick Parsons, gangly and awkward as ever, lurching into the clearing with a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, his face a sweaty mask of horror. "Dear Lord," Nick murmurs in a strangled voice, "cleanse us of all this unrighteousness." Nick raises the shotgun. The muzzle looks gargantuan, like an enormous planet eclipsing the sun, pointing directly at him. "I renounce all sins," Nick drones in his sepulchral voice. "Forgive me, O Lord, forgive me." Nick pulls the trigger. The firing pin snaps. The slow-motion blast flares in a brilliant yellow corona, the rays of a dying sun, and he feels himself lifted out of his boots, slingshot into space, weightless, flying through darkness, toward a nimbus of celestial white light. This is it. This is the end of the world. His world. The end of everything. He screams. No sound comes from his lungs. This is death. The suffocating magnesium white void of nothingness, and very suddenly, like a switch being thrown, Brian Blake ceases to exist. And that's how you completely destroy a man. By destroying not just his mind, as occurred when he first made his transformation, but his body as well. And in this new fractured, yet whole state, the governor has only one thing on his mind: revenge. And the only way he's going to get it is by organizing his people into an army. And he does so with expert propagandist zeal during a speech at the arena. "I apologize for being unavailable to you all recently." He pauses and surveys the silent faces. "I know some community matters have arisen that I've been unable to handle, and for that I apologize." No reaction emanates from the crowd other than a few throats clearing. "The games will be up and running again soon," he goes on, undaunted by the eerie silence and the tension so thick it seems to weigh down on the stadium like a fog. "But as you've probably noticed by looking at me, I've had other, more pressing matters to deal with." Another pause here, as the governor gazes across the rows of somber-faced residents. "As you know, it's been a long time since we've had new people arrive in town." He takes a deep breath as though girding himself against a surge of pain. "So, recently, when a small band of survivors showed up, I was thrilled. I figured they were like us, happy to be alive, thankful to see other survivors. But that was not the case." In the pause that follows, his words echo up into the sky and slap back at the crowd against the far storefronts. "There is evil in this world, and not all of it is in the form of those undead monsters clawing at our fences." Just for an instant, he glances down at the cardboard box next to him. "At first, I had no idea what they were capable of," Philip Blake continues, gazing back up at the gallery. "I trusted them. It was a grave mistake. They needed supplies, some things we seem to have plenty of. They live in a nearby prison. They took our head of security, Martinez, back with them. I guess there was talks of combining the camps, one group moving to the safest place to live." Now he kneels down by the box, and his voice goes low and thick with contempt. The microphone picks up every nuance, every smack of his lips, every click and crackle in the back of his throat. "Some of them stayed behind, and one night while my guard was down, they jumped me and tortured me, mutilated me, and then left me for dead. They escaped," he goes on, kneeling by that mysterious box as though a paper clown is about to pop out. But you all need to know this. He pauses and scans the crowd as though taking their measure. Along the way, they killed Dr. Stevens. These people are ruthless, inhuman savages. He pauses again, as though the exertion of his rage has already exhausted him. I feared for Martinez's life, the man goes on, not knowing if they'd taken him prisoner, or worse. Before we could send out a search party, something was left at the main gate overnight. He flips open the flaps on the top of the box. He pulls out a dark, glistening object about the size of a deflated basketball. They left this. He stands and displays the object for the perusal of all in attendance. Despite the collective inhaling of breaths, faint gasps, and averting of gazes among some of the spectators, a strange transference occurs in the audience. For a brief instant, as the governor silently holds the object for all to absorb, the head turns lazily on its pendulum of hair. I knew none of you would want to see this, and I apologize for shocking you. I just want to make you all completely aware of the kind of people we're dealing with here. Another dramatic pause from the governor. Monsters. The voice from the loudspeakers continues. These savages know where we live. They know what we have. They know our strengths, and they know our weaknesses. He scans the anguished faces. I say we strike at them before they have a chance to come at us. I refuse to stand down and allow them to destroy us. Not after everything we've lost. Not after everything we've sacrificed. Some of the spectators begin to holler encouragement, as though in a religious call and response. One man booms, "Fuck yeah!" Another one yells, "Damn straight!" And the voices rise and swell as the governor drowns the noise with his amplified growl. "We've worked too hard to build what we have here, and I'll be goddamned if I'm going to let anyone take it from me." The crowd roars. "I'm glad to see you feel the same way," the governor is telling the crowd now, his tone calming, his voice becoming almost hypnotic. "First, we need to find them. I know most of the people who lived in this area migrated to Atlanta when the government ordered us all into the cities, but there has to be someone here who has at least a passing familiarity with the area. If you do, please let me know. The prison they live in could be 5 miles away, or it could be 15, and we're not even sure of which direction it's in. This is not going to be easy, but it will get done. They will be punished. Of that, you can be sure." If you hadn't noticed, this entire speech is filled with lies, especially when you consider that Martinez was killed for betraying Rick's group, and his head was only taken back to Woodbury after his murder, and that Doc Stevens was killed by a walker, and with few around like Lily to hear the truth, all are put under the governor's spell and galvanized. But just as one's evil deeds often have grave consequences associated with them, you'll often find that revenge leads you down a path that ends in similar consequences. While formulating his plan to attack the prison, the governor makes the disgusting decision to rip out all of Penny's teeth to make their relationship more feasible, and he proceeds to show us how when he kisses her on the mouth, vomiting afterwards from the taste. In the meantime, a group from the prison raids Woodbury's Walmart and the National Guard station at the edge of town, blowing up the latter. And it's here that the governor makes a smart decision and decides that the Woodburyans should bide their time for a while so the people at the prison believe they're safe and lower their guard. Their subsequent surprise attack on the prison has its desired effect. The governor claims here that if the denizens of the prison surrender their arms and let them pass through, that there's a chance they can all still work together. But as the people at the prison correctly assume, I'm sure that was nothing more than a lie, and they refuse to comply. In the ensuing battle, several of Rick's group lose their lives, including Axel, Patricia, Alice, Billy Green, Tyrese, and Herschel Green, the latter two personally executed by the governor after he and Michonne attempt to flank his army, and after surrendering to the governor once his son falls respectively. Several citizens of Woodbury lose their lives as well, and as his army advances in a severely shaken state, spurred on only by the governor's fervent cries to press on, the final straw that breaks the camel's back is swung. Lily Call, the woman who has suffered heavily due to the governor's actions, and who attempted to overthrow him, had begun to believe that the governor was a necessary evil that people needed in these hard times to guide them through all the horror of this new world. She had even come to believe that the governor was a flawed, but good man, who was only doing what he needed to do for the sake of his people. Lily had entered into a relationship with another citizen of Woodbury, a man named Austin, and months prior she had become pregnant. Unfortunately, Lily had a miscarriage after she exerted herself on a mission to locate Martinez after he hadn't reported back from his trek to the prison. Now, if Lily had never gotten pregnant or had this miscarriage, I doubt that would have changed her feelings about what I'm about to tell you, but it still stands that Lily had become hardened by her miscarriage, giving her more than enough heartbreak to fuel her hatred towards Rick's group. But when the governor and his army rolled into the prison complex and were busying themselves with clearing out the rest of Rick's group, the governor ordered Lily to shoot a fleeing woman, and that fleeing woman was Lori Grimes, who was carrying in her arms the infant Judith Grimes, and when Lily shot, she ended up killing both of them. Now, what occurs after this moment is shown to us in the comics, but we're given much more detail in The Fall of the Governor Part 2, which I'll read for you now. For a moment, Philip Blake stares down at the old man now lying in a fresh pool of deep crimson blood next to his son, the puddle spreading, forming wings on the cement like a Rorschach ink blot test. Two angels lying in state, one next to the other, martyrs, sacrificial lambs. Philip starts to turn away when he hears another voice, anguished and grief-stricken, coming from somewhere nearby. He turns and sees that Lily Call has moved across the yard and now stands over the Grimes woman, who lies frozen in death on top of the pale remains of her baby. Austin Ballard stands 20 feet away from her, looking horror-struck and confused, spinning toward the oncoming biters. The herd has progressed across the grounds, closing the distance to about 30 yards or so. The stink and noise have risen to unbearable levels, and now some of the governor's men have begun firing at the front line, picking off the closest ones, one after another. What the f*** is her problem? The governor says to no one in particular as he strides over to where Lily stands, slowly shaking her head, her Remington still gripped in one hand, tendrils of glistening auburn hair unmoored from her ponytail and dangling in her face. The governor yells at her, "What the f*** is wrong with you? We gotta get our asses inside. What is your f*** deal? Answer me!" Very slowly, she turns and scorches him with such a contemptuous look that it nearly takes his breath away. She utters something that he doesn't hear at first, his one-eyed gaze held rapt by her blazing stare. "What was that?" he demands of her, his single-gloved hand balling into a fist. "You monster," she says again, louder this time though, through clenched teeth. The governor goes very still, serpentine still, a boa coiling itself in the presence of a threat. All this in spite of the looming threat of the horde filling the general vicinity with the odor of rotten meat and the sound of broken gears grinding and groaning. Very carefully, enunciating every word, the governor says, "What the f*** did you just say to me?" Austin whirls towards the governor and raises his gun as though trying to decide whom to shoot. "I said," Lily Call barks at him, her words like darts now, projectiles aimed at his face, fueled by scalding tears tracking down her face. "You are a monster. Look at what you made me do." Without tearing her gaze from him, she gestures down at the murdered woman and baby, the pathetic carnage joined in the eternal bond of mother clutching child to her bosom. "Just look." He does look now, and he does see, and maybe for the first time since he took control of Woodbury, Georgia, since he became the governor, the man who calls himself Philip Blake does see the consequences of his actions. Fuck, he utters to himself, his voice drowned by the clamor of gunfire staving off the pitiless, rotting, hellish onslaught now bearing down on them. "A baby," Lily roars at him. "A baby!" She turns her gun around and slams the butt into the governor's face. The pain shoots up the bridge of his nose, the impact making a wet thud that momentarily blinds him and drives him to the ground. "You made me kill a baby." The governor flops onto his back and tries to sit up, but his head is ringing like an alarm, the dizziness washing over him and stealing his breath. What are you?" Lily Call turns the barrel of her Remington around and lunges at him. She slams the blue steel muzzle into his mouth hard enough to crack two of his front teeth. The barrel lodges itself so deep in his throat that it forces a strangled gag out of him. Lily's finger starts to tighten on the trigger. Philip Blake's single eye finds her eyes. The entire world seems to stop, time standing still, as if hell is at last frozen over. "Lily, don't," the voice blurts out of the closest militia member. Some of them involuntarily raise their hands. Others aim their guns at Lily's head. She barely notices her fellow combatants as she stares down intensely at the kneeling governor, the barrel of her Remington still thrust into the man's mouth. Why isn't she firing? Inside her brain, a clock ticks, impassive, cold, cruel, undeniable, counting off the moments until she finally decides to yank the trigger the rest of the way and bring this terrible era to a conclusion. But she doesn't pull the lever. She just stares into the face of the poster boy for all that is base and feral and brutal in the human animal. What Lily doesn't realize though at that moment is that the gunmen have momentarily lost track of the oncoming horde. The first walkers, now shuffling a few paces ahead of the herd, have closed the distance across the weather-beaten grounds to about 25 yards. Now they lock their glassy doll eyes on the humans and trundle awkwardly toward the sweet scent of living tissue, their dead arms rising, their fingers curled into talons and innately reaching, clawing the air, eager to rip into the living. "Lily, listen to me," Austin says as he pushes his way through the other gunmen, pressing in next to her, speaking softly, yet urgently into her ear. "You don't have to do this. Listen to me. There are other ways to handle this. You don't need to do this." A single tear traces down from the corner of Lily's eye and drips off the edge of her jawline. "A baby, Austin. It was a baby." Austin fights his own tears. "I know, sweetie, but listen to me. This is not the way to..." He doesn't get a chance to finish his thought because a long shadow suddenly blots out the sun. His Glock still gripped in his right hand, Austin jerks around a split second before the first slimy, molting, claw-like fingers take a swipe at him with feral bloodlust. Lily twists around and screams. Austin jerks back and squeezes off 4 quick blasts, number 1 going high, numbers 2 and 3 going into the head of the closest spider, number 4 hitting a second one in the jugular. Meanwhile, the rest of the militiamen scatter, furiously blasting away at the army of reanimated corpses that are engulfing the area. The dusty haze flickers with gunfire, and plumes of muzzle flares percolating out of the assault rifles on full auto. Some of the men make mad dashes for the closest ingress, a door partially visible in the shadows of a nearby alcove, while others fire frantically into the heart of the encroaching herd. Lily turns back to the governor at the exact moment he makes his move. Grabbing the barrel of the Remington, Philip slams the butt of the rifle as hard as he can into Lily's face, and knocking her momentarily senseless. She jolts back with a start. The gun slips from her hand and clatters to the pavement as the governor springs to his feet. A biter lunges at Lily, and she smashes a boot into its midsection at the last possible moment. The dead teenager in gouged black leather doubles over and staggers backward, but doesn't go down. Lily manages to dart away, and while she runs, she reaches around to the back of her belt and grabs her .22, despite her double vision and throbbing, wet, bleeding lip. "Lily, this way!" Austin stands 20 feet north of her now, firing into another wave of biters coming from the opposite direction. He frantically indicates the alcove about 35 feet away. Lily hesitates. She glances over her shoulder. She sees the governor whirling around with a Remington rifle in his hands. A scream rings out in the opposite direction, and Lily spins around in time to see a Woodbury man, a squat heavyset pipefitter from Augusta named Clint Mansell, succumb to the black teeth of a huge male walker. Clint Mansell's watery choked death cry as he goes down gets the rest of the men moving. "There's too many of them," cries one of the older men as he backs towards the alcove, firing bursts from his AK at the gathering horde. Lily gets off a series of controlled blasts at a cluster of biters that are closing in on her. Each shot slams through a rotten cranium, sending plumes of black matter out the back of every skull when she hears the psychotic jabber of the governor behind her. "Don't panic. They can't outrun. Where the f*** is? Shut up. Listen to me. We can, shut the f*** up. We can get inside the, clear out the, we can rebuild the, we've got to stick together. We've got to stick together, people. Fuck. We can make this work." All at once, Lily feels a tingling sensation at the base of her spine and a strange kind of stillness coursing over her, the noise and chaos fading in her ears to a low drone. She ejects the spent magazine from the Ruger, draws another one from her belt, slams it into the hilt, and racks the slide. Then she turns toward the governor, who is gibbering at the voices in his head, his back turned to her. She has about 60 seconds before the next cluster of biters reaches her. She blocks out everything: the pain, the sound of Austin's voice calling out to her, the fear, the pandemonium, everything. 30 seconds now before the governor spins around and sees her. She aims the Ruger at the back of his head, and she sucks in a breath. 15 seconds. She aims. 10 seconds. She fires. Considering the fact that the .22 caliber long rifle 40-grain round strikes the governor in the back of his head, he feels surprisingly little pain. For one horrible instant, like a brain surgery patient remaining lucid and semi-conscious during his procedure, he remains upright, standing on faltering knees, his back to his assailant, only semi-aware of his mortality rushing toward him with the unstoppable inertia and brilliant white light of a freight train. A mere fraction of a second passes before his frontal lobe and the rest of his brain shut down and stops sending involuntary signals to his central nervous system. But it is enough time for his condition to register to the deepest chasms of his brain, the bad news spreading throughout his cerebral lobes and hemispheres, his memory centers, and the mysterious fissures and convolutions of his secret disorder. The face in his head returns with renewed strength, giving him even worse news that will carry him into oblivion. Philip Blake has been gone for nearly a year. Philip Blake is dust. Gone. The governor's reign has been a sham. A lie. "Ugh!" A garbled yowl comes out of the governor as he blindly staggers for a brief instant, trying to argue one last time with a voice in his head, his body now as heavy as an elephant, a dying elephant gripped in the paralysis of its own dead weight. The oncoming swarm of biters closes in, their talon-like fingers reaching en masse for the governor's warm, nourishing flesh. Their cumulative jet engine drone of rancid breath and watery groans makes one last impression on the governor's auditory nerves, the noise of the biter stampede engulfing him and drowning the inner voice needling the governor with the savage truth. He's gone. He's been gone for ages. He's in the ground. Dead. Gone. He no longer exists. The governor barely feels the sensation of being kicked in the small of the back by Lily. Her final nudges sends him reeling forward blindly, his one good arm pinwheeling futilely, almost comically, like the fin of a fish, as he plunges into the rotting, desiccated bosom of the reanimated cadavers. The biters practically catch him with their flailing arms and snapping jaws, and he collapses into the throng, writhing in the awful darkness, finding his voice one last time. Philip Blake lives. His death cry, albeit hoarse and bloodless and papery thin, is shockingly audible and clear to all those within a 100-foot radius. "Philip Blake lives!" he shrieks as the blackened, slimy teeth descend upon him, driving him to the ground, the last ghostly blips of brain activity, like a vinyl record stuck on the same incessant skipping phrase, over and over again. "Philip Blake lives! Philip Blake lives! Philip Blake lives! Philip Blake lives! Philip Blake lives!" Within moments, there's nothing left but the feeding in the blood, and the eternal white noise of Brian Blake's mind screen at the end of its programming day. And so, through many horrendous decisions, both selfish and made in mock service to others, Brian Blake meets his ultimate end. And while there's much to be said about the evils of this version of the character, and all that we've discussed, I'm going to delay summarizing his character until we've talked about the different aspects of the show's version of the governor, so we can discuss them together. So now, let's move on and start talking about Philip Blake. Unlike Brian Blake, who took on the name of his deceased brother following his demise, Philip Blake's name is his own. We don't know all too much about who Philip was before the outbreak. As far as his childhood goes, we do know that he was born and raised in Meriwether County, that he had a brother, and that his father was abusive to both of them, which is exemplified by a story Philip tells where his father beat both him and his brother after they were caught smoking, and his brother took the blame for it. This caused Philip to formulate the belief that heroes were fools who only suffer for their heroism, harming themselves and those around them in the process. As his life progressed, Philip found himself becoming a family man, with a wife and daughter who he loved more than anything else in the world. Philip seems to have become generally dissatisfied with his life over time though, as he states that he was just your average office worker working under a younger and lower IQ boss. Life would only worsen for Philip though when his wife was taken from him in a fatal car accident, leaving Penny the only shining light in his otherwise drab and mundane world. When the outbreak occurred, he fled with Penny and holed up in an apartment with 9 other survivors that included Martinez, Schumpert, and Milton Mamet, eventually moving on with them to the town of Woodbury, which they made their home, fortifying it and attracting numerous survivors, transforming it from a temporary camp into a thriving community. Eventually, Philip was given the role of leader of this community, adopting the moniker of the governor, which he claims he didn't approve of, but accepted nonetheless. At some point, further tragedy would strike Philip Blake in the form of his daughter's demise, something that hardened Philip into becoming a ruthless man who believed his weakness at the time of his daughter's death is what caused it to happen. And it's long been speculated that Penny may have lost her life at the hands of other survivors rather than walkers, much like she did in the comic, which would explain why Philip believes that his weakness is what sealed her fate. Despite the loss of his beloved daughter, the governor persevered, finding purpose in his mandate and focusing his efforts on molding Woodbury into a veritable fortress town. But there was something else that kept the governor moving forward, the possibility of bringing Penny back to life. Just like in the comics, the governor chose to keep Penny after she turned, tasking one of the original members of his group, Milton Mamet, with trying to find a potential cure for Penny's condition. And while this was a fool's dream, it kept the governor grounded enough to make him into the kindly-seeming man that we're first introduced to when Andrea and Michonne investigate a crashed helicopter in the woods. Now, the advantage that visual broadcast media has over printed media is its ability to show us how characters would look and act in the real world versus telling us or illustrating it for us. And the flesh and blood governor is quite the character. Unlike the comics version of the character, who's described and depicted as being a scrawny and menacing individual whose appearance at points is described as being that of a third-world dictator, this version of the governor is tall, handsome, and well-dressed and groomed, and he has a kind smile, a soothing southern drawl, and soft eyes, all of which give him the magnanimity that inherently draws people to his person. His mannerisms are kind, merry, and often relaxed, though he does have a habit of resting his hand on his gun. But perhaps the most unsettling thing about Philip Blake is that he often has this look on his face when he's speaking to someone that suggests that he's in on some private joke. And for lack of a better term, I'd call it a shit-eating grin. The main difference between the two governors, though, is that this one is a pragmatic gentleman who has heaps of charisma and charm that further serve to disarm anyone he encounters. The comic book's governor is handicapped by the fact that he looks like an evil bastard, but not Philip. He is a veritable wolf in sheep's clothing, and I suppose that would be the private joke that he's often so entertained by. While our first few meetings with the governor are full of that superficial charm that he displays so well, that's quickly thrown to the wayside once he reveals his true nature. Now, the hallmark of a great villain that appears to be good is their ability to drop that benevolent persona at the drop of a hat, and the governor is a master at doing so. After the governor learns that Lieutenant Wells, the lone survivor of the helicopter crash, was on his way to link up with his other comrades who managed to escape their overrun base with a load of military-grade weapons and vehicles in tow, he promises to find these men and bring them back to Woodbury, kindly reassuring this man that he'll keep them safe. In this moment, even though the governor's face is quite somber, he seems genuine and well-intentioned. But once he finds Lieutenant Wells' group, that quickly changes. The governor approaches them with a white flag in hand, a smile, and the words necessary to get these men to lower their guard, reassuring them that he's here on behalf of their friend and is ready to take them with him back to his safe haven. In less than a second, he drops his smile, his face becoming a mask of seriousness that serves as the perfect accompaniment to the shot he fires into a man's shoulder. The barrage of bullets of a well-planned ambush serenading his dark approach, and he even takes it upon himself to execute one of these men in gruesome fashion with the butt of his gun. Later, we find him returning to his home, a king whose control over his fiefdom is only further solidified by these armaments, a king who enjoys comforts few can in this broken world. And after we see him gaze longingly at an old family photo amongst this decadent scenery, we are once again treated to a dramatic shift as he enters a room where he keeps the fish tanks filled with undead heads, the newest addition being that of Lieutenant Wells, a hard look on his face as he contemplates his next dreaded move, while immersing himself further in darkness. Now this is the perfection of this character, the jump between light and dark that highlight how brutal this clean-cut servant of the people actually is. And for this version of the character, it's present in nearly every scene that he's in. He's an apex predator, one that has flourished in the chaos and carnage of this fractured plane to make the entire world his prey, and he's always hunting. But just like with his comic book counterpart, it wasn't always this way, and one of the mechanisms we're given to show us this is a notebook that Michonne finds when she's searching his apartment. In this notebook, we find some notes and even a diary entry that indicate Philip was quite well-intentioned when he first became leader of Woodbury. But when she turns a couple pages, we find a list of names, and at the bottom of that list is his daughter's underlined name. Because of the presence of her name here, we can assume that this was meant to be a running tally of the people he'd lost. But after Penny's name, all that's written for several pages are scribbles of diagonal lines. Now this expounds upon something that we've already talked about, the fact that the governor's entire world was centered around his daughter, and once he lost her, his world was shattered. But this visually emphasizes for us something that I cannot emphasize enough, that whoever Philip Blake was, whatever good intentions he had, ended the moment that Penny perished. And what remained was only darkness and the cruelty of a man in a cruel world willing to do whatever it takes to keep his hold on power, potentially revive his daughter, and live his life as comfortable as he can make it. However, for a man who entertains the shadows on a daily basis, things were bound to change. And while Woodbury is rather pristine on the surface, it's rotten at its core. Aside from his willingness to kill living people, to take their goods, just like in the comics, we find that the governor orders or participates in the torture of two of Rick's group. In this case, Maggie and Glenn, and while what he does and has Merle do here is nowhere near as brutal, the scene where he assaults Maggie further emphasizes for us just how slimy the governor is, parading a shirtless Maggie in front of Glenn to further wear down both their spirits with the implications of his actions. But retribution meets him swiftly once Michonne returns, and again, though it isn't as brutal as it is in the comics, the loss of Penny and the loss of his eye only sends the governor further into darkness and despondency, which is only further exacerbated by his condemnation of Merle for bringing members of Rick's group into Woodbury, as when the governor organizes an execution by Walker for the Dixon brothers, it's interrupted by a rescue mission organized by Rick, which results in the death of 7 citizens of Woodbury. From this point onward, the governor only has one thing on his mind: revenge and the slow march to it. For a time, he lets the town turn to shambles due to his obsession with killing the people responsible for further ruining his world, giving us a display of his callous cruelty when he executes a citizen who's been turned after a walker got through the walls without so much as a word or a flicker of emotion. And when he admits to Andrea that he isn't up for being a leader at that period in time, he decides to leave Woodbury under her control for a short while so he can go to the prison to negotiate with Rick. His negotiations end up being a swift shot to the head for Axel, a shootout, and a destruction of one of the prison's fences so his men can unleash a trailer of walkers into the prison. When he returns, he claims that the prison group shot at him first, and that they're bloodthirsty animals that need to be put down as a threat to the stability of Woodbury. And so he begins organizing his citizens, even the most feeble amongst them, into a well-trained army in preparation for a full-on invasion of the prison. Now, throughout all of this, the governor only offers slight hints of glib warmness when he's speaking to some of his citizens, but otherwise, he more often than not remains cold and uncaring, his mind focused only on murder and revenge. And while there was some hints of sadism given to us in his previous actions, it's on full display for us now as we see him taking immense joy out of the suffering he causes to his foes at any chance that he's given, especially during and after the initial assault on the prison. But this change in the governor is made all the more apparent during his negotiation with Rick. Here we once again get to see all the mannerisms and speech patterns that make the governor such a magnificent villain. Throughout this short conversation, we get to see the governor's facial expressions and mannerisms expertly skirt the line between his benevolent and charming facade and his monstrous underbelly, especially when he's telling Rick about his wife's accident and his former life. Joy rises and falls in his face in fractions of seconds as he recounts the story of his wife's accident, the struggle between the governor of old and the memories he has as a family man conflicting with the creature he is now. And to watch the subtle changes in his face as he speaks is a testament to the stellar performance of David Morrissey. In reference to Shane, the governor says that Rick is having to deal with the paternity of his daughter because of his failure to see the devil beside him, to which Rick responds that he sees him all right. And in many ways, the governor, at least during his arc, is the devil of the Walking Dead universe. He's only ever looking out for himself, his own desires, and what he can get out of people. And sometimes, he does that by taking care of them. But he'll also do whatever it takes to get what he wants, and to get the better of his foes, even if that means sacrificing everything. During this conversation, the governor comments that if they fight, they're going to destroy everything that they've worked for over the last year, everyone at the prison, everyone at Woodbury, everyone they love. But the way that the governor says this to Rick emphasizes for us that it's not the consequences of battle that are going to cause this to happen, but because the governor is quite ready to throw every life in Woodbury away just to extinguish every life at the prison. For the governor only loves one person now, himself, and everyone else be damned. So in many ways, what Rick is doing here is trying to make a deal with the devil, and that deal stipulates that should he give up one woman, Michonne, the rest of his people will be safe from the governor's vengeful wrath. Now in many scenarios, the choice to sacrifice the few for the sake of the many might be the appropriate course of action to take, but what this situation presents to Rick is not a split-second life or death decision that will make or break his group, but a test of his humanity. Will Rick Grimes, in the face of a monster, acquiesce to his wishes and take the easy way out, or will he fight tooth and nail for every last soul under his protection, because ultimately, that is the right thing to do? This dilemma is only a dilemma for Rick because the governor is asking Rick to give up someone he hardly knows. But Rick has to come to a realization here that all of us struggle to reach at different points in our lives, that giving up the life of someone you hardly know should always be tempered by one question. What would I do if it were someone close to me that he was asking for? What if he had asked Rick to give him his son? Would he have entertained that notion for even a fraction of a second? The answer is of course no. And that, among many other things, is one of the many aspects of a truly good person that separates them from men like the governor, as the governor has almost completely lost what it means to be human, and he is more than ready to give up any of even his most valued people at the drop of a hat because he is so far gone that he truly believes he has nothing to lose and everything to gain, that the lives under his care are not but toys that don't deserve any due consideration as human beings. And to fail this test on Rick's part would only mean that he is no better than a monster in the flesh of a man. Furthermore, the governor is a man that is not to be trusted, for everything that falls out of his mouth should always be taken as if it were a lie. As if Rick had given the governor Michonne, he would have only delayed the inevitable, not prevented it. A fact which is confirmed for us when the governor returns to town and tells Milton that when they meet again in 2 days so Rick can think over the proposition, that the governor's forces are going to slaughter the lot of them, no matter what he decides. Now what this conversation also highlights for us is the fact that the governor is no longer operating with any sort of logic. He's conducting his affairs purely with his own emotions and desires in mind, which is exemplified by Rick telling the governor that he seems like a man with big plans, who presents himself as the man who's going to bring humanity back from the brink, which would make such a petty vendetta a pointless affair. But the governor doesn't even dignify this statement with an appropriate response, instead choosing to continue his line of thinking by telling Rick that he can save his son and daughter if he does as he asks, offering us further proof that there's nothing more to this man now than his revenge. From this point on, the governor does a number of horrific things. Clad in his sinister eye patch and duster, the governor begins prepping a torture chamber for Michonne, hunts Andrea in a terrifying sequence that displays just how menacing and sadistic he is, dispatches Merle in a savagely brutal fight scene after Merle attempts to execute him, and he then proceeds to torture both Milton and Andrea once he discovers that the former has sabotaged his tactic to use walkers to fight Rick, and he's captured the latter, fighting against himself as people around him attempt to foil his plans. If there's a threat, you end it, and you don't feel ashamed about enjoying it. A quote from the governor that goes a long way in showing us how his mind works. When the assault on the prison finally comes, this governor fails even more spectacularly than he did in the comics, and once he's forced to run home with his tail between his legs, the fruit of his dark labors is finally ready to harvest. Chaos. His people have lost their confidence in him. They're not murderers or soldiers, but survivors. And after suffering this loss, they see no reason to continue fighting when it's only going to result in the loss of more of their own, and rightly so. In this moment though, as everything Philip has become and worked for comes crashing down, there is nothing left in him but pure, unbridled rage, and he proceeds to execute nearly everyone present. As harrowing as this moment is, unfortunately, unlike the comic governor, the governor doesn't receive his due just yet. But because he doesn't, we get to see something most of us wouldn't have imagined possible at this point: the governor's chance at redemption, a redemption that he certainly doesn't deserve. After murdering all of these people, the governor tears off with his lieutenants Martinez and Shumpert in tow, and we see in a montage that the governor is eventually abandoned by them, after which he returns to Woodbury and sets it ablaze. As the governor is walking aimlessly through the world sometime later, we hear a conversation he has between himself and a woman that he'd happen upon sometime later. And here, the governor tells her of his origins and the town he came from, and that he had to leave because the man in charge just lost it. It would seem that defeat has brought the governor a certain degree of clarity, as this is the type of introspection that we would have never received from the governor following his decision to dedicate all his efforts towards revenge. This is only made more apparent when the governor chances upon the Chandler family, who graciously take him in after he assists them with obtaining oxygen tanks for their sick patriarch, and clears out some of the walkers in the apartment building they're staying in. The governor ends up falling in love with one of the Chandler sisters, Lily Chandler, who is a combination of two characters from the comic, Lily Call and April Chalmers, the woman who the original Philip Blake fell in love with and assaulted that we talked about earlier. And through his relationship with her, he gains for himself a new daughter to replace the one he lost, a young girl named Megan. During this period, we're given an image of who the governor must have been before he became the monster we all know him as, a family man who's willing to do whatever it takes to keep his loved ones safe. And for a short period of time, it seems like the governor is going to move on from his dark past and become the man he once was again, even if he doesn't deserve it. But that all changes after he convinces the Chandlers to abandon their home and go on the road with him. And that's because this new happy family chances upon something that sends the governor spiraling down into his old ways, a reminder of what he had done and who he had become in the form of Martinez. After the family decides to make themselves at home with this group, things seem like they might turn out okay for the governor, even with Martinez around. But Martinez makes a grave error that he could have never known would be one when he's hitting some golf balls with the governor, asking the governor to share in the leadership responsibilities with him. Power is one of the most corrupting influences in this world. It can turn even the most righteous and virtuous amongst us into despots and tyrants, whether that be because of the temptation it brings or due to the stressors associated with such power. The governor realizes this, and now, in this moment, he's struggling with his desire for power and control, and the delightfully barbaric feelings that it once instilled within him, while also struggling with his partial rebirth as the good man he once was. And so the two personas come together in one brutal swing of a golf club, incapacitating Martinez as if swatting away his temptations, while also eliminating one of the obstacles preventing him from acquiring a new throne. And both fight with one another as he drags Martinez down to a pit of walkers and holds him over the edge. The governor doesn't share his crown, but Philip Blake doesn't want a crown because he knows it will destroy him. And so even though he's taken Martinez's life into his hands as he's dangling him over this pit, it's his life that he's struggling with here. And unfortunately for not just Philip Blake, but everyone else around him, the governor wins. After this comes murder and more plans for revenge. Plans to murder innocents because they aren't innocents that he cares about, just obstacles in his path towards becoming whole, or what he believes will make him whole. A new throne with a new wife and daughter by his side that will accomplish all that the governor couldn't with Woodbury. After capturing Michonne and Herschel and convincing his new flock to advance with him to the prison with promises of retribution for who he's lost, as well as a safe haven for all of them, the governor reignites his conflict with Rick's group. And here we're made to witness the heart-wrenching and brutal execution of Herschel, as well as the deaths of several of his group. But to really drive home what horror all that the governor is and has done is brought, we see his new love walk onto this scene with the corpse of his new daughter, a girl who this man had pledged to protect that fell to the walkers while he was away waging his vengeful war. And this is all that the governor's quest for revenge has brought: death and more death. Death of people innocent and guilty, of those he loved and those he should have cared for as his fellow man, but whom he saw as nothing more than beasts that needed to be dealt with. After a fight with Rick, the governor is finally dealt a mortal wound by Michonne, after which Lily is able to avenge her daughter by ending the governor with his own gun. A better end than a man responsible for so much suffering could have ever hoped to ask for. And now that we've come to the end of his story, what is there to say about all that we've learned about these two versions of this character? I know we talked about them a lot, but let's get a quick overview of all their crimes so we can better sum up their characters. For Brian Blake, you have the direct or indirect murder of 23 people, the torture of several others, the assault of 2 women, and the promotion of an environment that caused some of those murders, and the destruction of both Woodbury and the prison. For Philip Blake, you have the direct or indirect murder of 69 people, the manipulation of several others, the torture of Andrea, Milton, Maggie, and Glenn, and the destruction of Woodbury and the prison. Now, when you hear these facts and numbers, and you accompany them with all the horrid particulars of their characters that we just went through, that's quite the staggering amount of suffering that these two men have caused. But as much as the numbers are harrowing, it really is about the particulars. And just like with so many villains, the particulars of both governors begin and end with trauma and tragedy. Both Brian and Philip Blake were by all accounts good men, but as they experienced a series of traumatic events, they fell deeper into a dark pit of despair as they forced themselves to become monsters for the sake of their people. Now, the thing about this mindset is that while it isn't completely correct, there is some merit to the idea. In a world where everything has crumbled and you're forced to deal with undead monsters wearing the face of your loved ones or your fellow man, either you face the challenges presented to you or you crumple in the face of them. And to face such dire challenges, one needs to be ready to take drastic measures in order to protect themselves and those they care for. And sometimes those measures end up being quite monstrous. But there's a difference between making a hard and morally questionable choice and letting those choices define who you are. We can look to various protagonists in this series as examples of how one can honorably conduct themselves in these circumstances, make hard choices, and still retain their humanity. People like Rick Grimes or Glenn Rhee, who, while forced to do horrendous things, managed to retain their sanity and their souls. Brian and Philip, on the other hand, came to the conclusion that only monsters could take the necessary action to keep people safe. And so as much as they might not wish to be such men, they feel that they must. But if you stare long enough into the abyss stares back into you. And letting the tough decisions they needed to make to find them is ultimately what corrupted them into creatures that are infinitely more horrifying than the undead that shamble all about them. In Brian's case, there is an argument to be made that he wasn't given much choice in the matter, as after witnessing his niece's murder, his brother's murder, and then having to murder his brother's killer, who was also a longtime family friend, his mind was utterly broken to the point that he took on his elder brother's identity, believing that only men like Philip Blake could make it in this new world, embodying who his brother had been before he himself became broken by the death of his daughter. Still, Brian was very much alive within the governor, and while we can find some sympathy for the man, in the end, he chose to be the man he became, and the man he became deserves nothing but the utmost condemnation. Philip, on the other hand, is decidedly much less deserving of sympathy, for he was as sane and lucid as they come. The only problem Philip had is he developed a similar mindset to Brian, believing that had he been a stronger man when he lost his daughter, that he would have never lost her at all. And vowing to never lose anything that he cared for again, Philip enmeshed himself in his baser instincts and desires so thoroughly that it completely corrupted his person. What made matters worse, though, is that both these men had a significant level of intelligence to back up their actions that made it so their dark designs succeeded more often than they failed, only meeting true failure once they dedicated themselves to revenge, which is a path that often leads to failure for anyone who takes it. As the governor, Brian and Philip Blake were cruel, sadistic, cold, disgusting, and utterly without mercy. Men shaped by a hard world, tragedy, and trauma that reflected back the pain they had experienced tenfold on dozens of people. Their willful acts of violence and cruelty, destroying innocent lives in a world where life was now more scarce and precious than it ever had been before. Would Brian or Philip Blake have become these monstrosities had the outbreak never occurred? In all likelihood, no, they wouldn't have. Brian would have remained the ambitious, yet foolish man drifting through the world, and Philip would have stayed the grief-stricken single father who was going through the motions of life as he cared for the only light left in his world. But neither of them would have ever come close to being the men that they became. And in a way, it was not Brian or Philip Blake who committed all these horrific acts of evil that we've explored in this video, but the governor. A man created by hardships that we can scarcely imagine. A monster worse than the monsters that helped to create him. And above all else, the story of the governor is a testament to one simple fact, one that every single one of us would do well to keep in mind as we move through this world, that evil will always breed more evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on the governor? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.